Hey guys, tonight we're slipping back into a world where romance was more about properly folded calling cards and less about swiping right. A world where dating didn't even exist as a word the way we know it today. We're headed into the layered, buttoned up and rule-obsessed world of Victorian courtship. And let's just say, you probably won't survive this. Not just emotionally, socially, financially. You're about to be judged by everyone from your third cousin to the neighbour's maid, and even your stationery will be scrutinised. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment too. What city are you in, and what time is it for you right now? I'm always curious who's up listening to this stuff in the middle of the night. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing in a drawing room, not yours of course, you're visiting. It's mid-afternoon, and the air is heavy with the scent of boiled cabbage and fireplace smoke. You hold a calling card, your best one. Smooth cream-coloured paper, your name pressed in elegant type. The corners are just slightly rounded. Fancy, but not too fancy. You don't want to look desperate. This isn't just a piece of paper, it's a social missile, packed with more unspoken intent than any text you've ever sent. You hand it to the footman, who glances at you like you might be contagious, then disappears behind a polished door. You wait. You're not even sure if she's home. And if she is, will she receive you? Here's how it works. In polite society, you don't just show up unannounced and hope for the best. You leave your card. If the lady of the house likes you or her parents do, you'll be invited back. Maybe. But don't get ahead of yourself. She might just leave her card at your house the next day with the corner folded in a way that means, not interested, but thank you. Or worse, she might not respond at all, which means you are now effectively ghosted by Victorian standards. Brutal, quiet, no closure. The calling card system is a masterclass in passive-aggressive communication. You can't just ask someone out. You initiate a social chess game, played on embroidered sofas and within strictly timed calling hours that end promptly at 5 p.m, after which it would be downright scandalous to knock. You have to bring another person with you if you're not already family, preferably someone boring and respectable, like a clergyman uncle, and if the visit goes well, congratulations. You might be allowed to visit again in 2 weeks, possibly even talk to her. There's also the curtsy. You see it everywhere. Small, graceful, barely there movements of knees and skirts like a synchronized social dance. It's subtle, but the angle, depth, and timing of the curtsy says everything about your status, your attitude, and your interest. You practice it in front of the mirror. You have to, because one wobble, one awkward bend, and that's it. You're branded as uncouth. A social leper. Meanwhile, you're not alone in the drawing room. There's a mother somewhere nearby knitting and watching. There's always a chaperone. She's pretending not to listen, but every giggle, every stammered compliment is being carefully recorded and interpreted. You compliment her daughter's piano playing? That's a point. You stare too long at her exposed wrist? That's a scandal. Better keep your admiration for clavicles and elbows strictly internal. Here's a historical fact for you. The entire calling card ritual exploded in popularity during Queen Victoria's reign because everything in that era became more formal, especially among the rising middle class. These people weren't aristocrats, but they were determined to act like it. Suddenly everyone needed a card, a butler, and a strict visitor policy to prove they belonged. Now here's your quirky fringe fact. Some cards were fragrant. That's right. People would actually scent their calling cards with perfume, hoping to leave a more aromatic impression. One popular scent, violet water. Lovely name, smells like soap and crushed flowers, and maybe if you're lucky, romance. Of course, some folks went overboard. A card reeking of lavender and desperation. Yikes. As for scholarly debate, historians still argue whether these elaborate social rituals actually work to create more stable relationships, or if they just built elaborate traps for young people who barely knew each other. Did all these rules protect women, or just control them? It's a fair question when you consider how little autonomy most had during courtship. You're not dating each other, you're navigating a parentally controlled minefield. But tonight, let's imagine you're in it, right now, sitting in a stiff chair, tea cooling in your cup, making small talk about the weather and the quality of the local vicar's sermons, all while your brain screams, do they like me? Do I smell okay? Should I compliment the curtains? Time's up. Your visit must not exceed 15 minutes. You stand, bow or curtsy, and leave your faint hope behind with your card. She might glance at it later, She might remember your name. And if she does, then maybe, just maybe, you'll be invited back next week for another 15 minutes of painfully formal conversation. But hey, in this era, that counts as flirting. So you've made it through the first visit. Congratulations. You survived without accidentally insulting the wallpaper, falling asleep during tea, or stepping on the family dog. That puts you ahead of at least 3 other suitors this month. But now comes the hard part. Doing it all again, with company. No, not the fun kind of company. We're talking about chaperones, the Victorian answer to absolutely not. You're standing in the same parlour, same velvet chairs, same overwatered ferns by the window, same overly watchful mother pretending to embroider a handkerchief she's been working on since 1842. This time, though, you've brought someone too. Maybe an aunt. Maybe a trusted male family friend. They're sitting beside you like a living alarm system, designed to make sure nothing untoward happens, like prolonged eye contact. Because here's the truth. Being alone with someone you were interested in? Absolutely not. Not done. Not proper. Not allowed. The rule was clear. No unchaperoned meetings between unmarried people of the opposite sex. Otherwise, your reputation could be compromised. Compromised in this case means ruined. Scorched earth. One whisper of impropriety, and your name is toast at every tea table from Bath to Yorkshire. There's a kind of comedy in it. You and your romantic interest, awkwardly trying to ask about each other's hobbies, while 2 adults sit nearby pretending to read. Pretending. But they're listening. Always listening. You ask, "Do you enjoy riding?" She says, "Yes, especially side saddle." And in the background someone clears their throat just a bit too loudly. Subtle reminder. No innuendos. Ever. Here's a wild historical fact. There were actually books written for chaperones. Whole manuals on how to properly monitor interactions. Some advise sitting at an angle to allow peripheral supervision without seeming intrusive. Others suggested interrupting conversations every 5 minutes to reset the mood. Reset the mood? Imagine your mum showing up every time you flirted and saying, "All right, let's all breathe for a moment and talk about the weather again." Of course, the chaperone wasn't always the mother. In wealthier households, a paid companion might step in. An older lady, underpaid and underwhelmed, whose full-time job was ensuring no one had a good time. Sometimes this companion had stories. She'd been in love once, maybe. She understood. But she also knew the rules and had no problem reminding everyone constantly. Now, not everyone obeyed the rules perfectly. Enter the walk in the garden, the Victorian loophole. You and your interest could technically be alone in the outdoors, but only if someone followed at a respectable distance. So there you are, walking side by side on a gravel path, trying to say something witty while a governess or butler looms 20 feet behind like a slow-moving moral anchor. This brings us to a peculiar fringe fact. In some households, mirrors were strategically placed in parlours to allow parents to monitor the couple's body language from another room. Yes, the original CCTV. They'd literally check for the spacing between knees. Too close. That was a scandal. 1 inch could be the difference between upstanding suitor and this man must never return. Now for the scholarly debate. Were chaperones genuinely there to protect young women or to control them? Some historians argue that the presence of a chaperone kept unwanted advances at bay in a society where women had little legal recourse. Others say it was more about preserving family honour than personal safety, and that many young women were perfectly capable of navigating relationships without being surveilled like prisoners of love. It's a murky space. On one hand, there's protection, on the other, surveillance. And let's not forget that chaperones weren't foolproof. Plenty of scandalous moments still managed to happen. Behind the rose bushes, under the piano, in the brief flicker of time it took someone to refill the tea tray. The Victorians might have been repressed, but they were also creative. You're starting to realise that every interaction is like a performance. You're not just talking, you're auditioning. For the parents, for society, for a future in which the smallest slip could lead to total rejection. One ill-timed joke, one mispronounced French phrase, one too friendly smile, and the lady of the house might decide you're simply not suitable. And that's that. No appeal, just silence. And yet, despite the surveillance, there's a kind of thrill to it all. Each smile shared across a room, each word whispered just a little too quietly, each time your fingertips brush accidentally while passing the sugar. It's like a dance, slow, silent, and full of tension. You're not allowed to touch, but you're constantly thinking about it. You can't speak freely, but you learn to read glances like paragraphs. Sometimes the chaperones help. Some of them root for you, the ones who've seen too many failed matches, too many lonely years. Maybe your aunt gives you an extra 5 minutes. Maybe the governess loses track of time by the koi pond. Occasionally someone decides to bend the rules for love or for the drama. Eventually the visit ends. Again. No hugs, no lingering. Just a bow, a soft goodbye, maybe a half smile if you're feeling bold. You leave, your heart racing from a conversation that, to an outsider, sounded like polite murmuring about horses and rainfall. But something's changed. The parents approve, or at least they don't disapprove. The chaperone didn't report anything suspicious. Your calling card is still on the tray. You're still in the game. And in Victorian courtship, that's the biggest win of all. You never thought you'd be this excited about an invitation to a dance. But here you are, straightening your waistcoat in the mirror, heart thudding like you've just chugged 5 espressos. Except you don't have coffee because it's 1873 and your stimulant options are limited to anxiety and weak tea. This is no ordinary evening. It's the social event of the month. A formal Victorian ball, and you've managed to secure a ticket, a tailor-pressed outfit, and, most importantly, an official spot on the dance card of the person you've been trying very hard not to flirt with too obviously in front of her mother. This is where things happen. If the calling card was your trailer, this is your theatrical release. The ballroom is dazzling, lit by gaslight chandeliers flickering just enough to cast flattering shadows on everyone's features. The floor is polished to near-glass perfection. Music swells from the corner, where a quartet of exhausted musicians begin yet another waltz. Your gloves are on, white and tight. Everyone's gloves are white. Everything's white, except the blush in your cheeks and the silent war going on between everyone's eyes. And here's where it gets wild. This dance isn't just about fun, it's a matchmaking coliseum. Every movement, every partner change, every glance. Strategic. You don't just waltz with whoever you want. Oh no, you need to be on a dance card, and those fill up fast. Ladies walk in with dance cards dangling from ribbons around their wrists, tiny booklets where partners are penciled in for each musical number of the night. If you're not listed, you're not dancing. The dance card is both your best hope and your worst enemy. Securing a spot on it is a feat, especially for popular women who might have suitors literally lined up across the ballroom. But land 1 or 2 spots? That's gold. It's time with her without the watchful eye of a parlour lamp and an eavesdropping aunt. In the chaos of the dance, you might actually get to speak in something above a whisper. You finally get your turn. The music changes, a quadrille, upbeat and confusing. But you've practiced. You meet at the centre, take your position, and she smiles. That's a good sign. Or maybe she's just being polite. Either way, your palms are sweating inside your gloves and there's no turning back. Historical fact. The Victorian ballroom functioned as the closest thing to a dating app that society would tolerate. It was one of the only sanctioned spaces where young, unmarried people could interact semi-freely, and it was engineered to maximise short but meaningful contact. Just long enough to gauge compatibility, not long enough to ruin anyone's reputation. 2 minutes here, 3 minutes there, like a highly choreographed speed date set to classical music. You lead into the steps, turn, step, glance, speak. Her eyes flick to the chaperone sitting nearby, and then back to you. You murmur something about the room being overly warm. She says she prefers the country to the city. There's something in the way she holds herself. Poised, yes, but not rigid. She's letting you in, a little. You feel like you're communicating more through dance than you ever could in a drawing room. Then there's the fringe fact of the night. Many dancers, especially men, would rent gloves for events like this. Rent gloves. Because new ones were expensive, and nobody wanted to show up with yellowed fingertips or frayed stitching. Of course, rented gloves weren't exactly sanitary. You're basically dipping your hands into someone else's dried sweat and dead skin particles, then reaching out to gently cradle someone's waist. Romance. You're halfway through the set, the music rising. You haven't stepped on her foot, which is already a success. She's laughing, genuinely it seems, at something you said. And then, just as things are going well, the dance ends. Her next partner is already approaching. You bow, she curtsies. You're replaced in seconds, left standing on the edge of the floor trying to burn the moment into your memory before it vanishes into gaslight and harp notes. Some dance nights lasted until 2 or 3 in the morning. Feet sore, corsets tight, powdered wigs slightly askew for the older guests, and still the young couples danced. Not because they weren't exhausted, but because each number was another chance, another possibility. You'd hear people boasting later, "We danced twice in one night." In Victorian dating, that's practically second base. Now here's where historians debate things. Were these balls empowering for young women, or just another arena for pressure and performance? On the surface, a dance might seem like freedom, a chance to choose your partners, to flirt, to speak. But in reality, a woman's choices were heavily shaped by family expectation, social status, and a million invisible rules. Could she reject a partner without causing offence? Could she ask someone herself? Usually no, she waited, and hoped someone worth dancing with asked in time. You're watching now from the wall. Not dancing, just observing, heart still pounding. You see her again, across the floor. Her fan is in her hand, fluttering ever so slightly. You don't know if it's from exertion or excitement. Maybe both. Someone else spins her away before you can wave. And there it is. The Victorian version of losing a match. No message. No second dance. Just the image of her twirling out of reach while you stand there, gloves slightly damp, wondering what could have been said in one more waltz. Still, you're not defeated. You danced. You were on her card. You made her laugh. And maybe, just maybe, your name gets remembered after the last song fades and the room is quiet once more. The letter arrives on a Wednesday. Pale cream paper, sharp folded, sealed in wax. Not just any wax, blue. Blue is bold. Blue is personal. The initials pressed into the seal are hers. You stare at it like it might explode, heart jackhammering in your chest, which is ridiculous because it's just a letter. But also, it's not just a letter, it's the letter. Victorian courtship is built on a foundation of awkward glances and glove touches, sure, but the real heat, that's in the mail. The love letter is the sacred text of 19th century romance. This isn't a quick, "Hey, had fun at the dance" sort of note. No, this is full-blown, soul-bearing, sonnet-sprinkled correspondence. You're expected to write like your entire future depends on your penmanship and emotional vocabulary, and honestly, it kind of does. You crack the seal carefully. The parchment inside is thick and slightly scented. Violet water again, of course, the unofficial fragrance of polite longing. Her handwriting curls across the page in tight, perfect script, each word looking like it was written with her entire soul and a ruler. You start to read, and immediately your ears are warm. This isn't just small talk. This is feeling, layered under polite metaphor, wrapped in 10 layers of social code, and probably triple-checked by her mother before she sent it. But still, it's feeling. She thanks you for the dance. She mentions the breeze from the open window, how it reminded her of childhood summers in Sussex. She hopes your gloves weren't too warm. Subtle, yes, but beneath it all, there's an unmistakable heartbeat. She liked you. She's opening the door just a crack with ink and metaphor and perfect margins. You sit down immediately to respond, heart thudding like it's 1812 and you're a cannon. You pick your best paper, the kind with pressed floral edges. You dip your pen, pray your hand doesn't shake, and begin. Victorian love letters are where the drama lives. With spoken words limited and physical touch nearly forbidden, people channeled every smouldering thought into ink. You tell her that the dance was the highlight of your season, that her laughter made the music sound sweeter. You try not to sound obsessed. You absolutely sound obsessed. Historical fact, some of the most famous Victorian love letters ever written came from actual royals and poets. And let's just say, Victorians didn't do casual. Take Robert Browning and Elizabeth Barrett. Their letters are basically emotional marathons with multiple pages per day, declarations of agony, joy, longing, and all the dramatic punctuation one could manage. That's not the exception. That's the vibe. Meanwhile, your letter is now 3 pages long, and you've quoted Byron twice. You end it with something like, "I remain, with the utmost regard, your devoted servant," because you can't exactly write Soxo. You seal it in wax, probably red, classic, and deliver it via messenger. Or if you're feeling bold, you hand it off yourself to her butler, who looks like he eats amateur suitors for breakfast. Fringe fact. Some people hired professional letter writers. Yep, ghostwriters for your feelings. If you were too nervous or not particularly poetic, you could pay someone to write a romantic letter on your behalf. Imagine outsourcing your entire emotional vulnerability to a guy named Harold, who lives above a print shop and only writes by candlelight while listening to sad violin solos. Now, let's talk about the debate. Were these over-the-top letters genuine expressions of love, or just performative fluff designed to meet societal expectations? Some scholars argue that the constraints of Victorian life forced lovers to develop a whole new emotional language, one that actually deepened intimacy. Others believe it was just elaborate theatre, with everyone saying what they thought they were supposed to say, not what they actually felt. You could be both passionately in love and completely full of it. That's the beauty of ink on paper. Who's going to call you out? But here's the real kicker. These letters are now semi-permanent. You've committed thoughts to physical form. If she keeps it, you're in her heart, or her scrapbook. If she burns it, well, that's a message too. Letters were often read aloud to mothers, friends and nosy cousins, dissected like delicate gossip bombs. Did he say fondly or devotedly? Did he underline it? You're pacing now, waiting for her reply. Days pass. Maybe she's sick. Maybe she's busy. Maybe she read it and laughed, or cried, or read it to the dog and then threw it in the fire. The not knowing is a form of exquisite torment that modern texts could never match. No read receipts, no typing icon, just silence, and then it arrives. Another letter, different paper, pale blue this time with a pressed flower tucked inside. You inhale, lavender, or maybe crushed gardenia. You open it carefully. She writes of the garden, of how the rain today reminded her of the rhythm of your last dance. She thanks you for your words. She says she hopes to see you again at the Harringtons' garden party. That's it. But it's enough. You're still in the game. You tuck the letter into a box beneath your bed, along with a handkerchief she once dropped, and your entire romantic sanity. You reread it before sleep, lips mouthing the words in the dark like a spell. This is the closest thing you've got to intimacy right now. Flirtation in sentences, longing in loops of ink, and somehow it's enough. For now, you spot her from across the garden, just beneath a stone arch wrapped in drooping wisteria. Sunlight cuts through the leaves above, dappling her dress with moving shadows, and she's fanning herself slowly, methodically even. It's not that warm. The movement is for your benefit. Every flick of her wrist, every tilt of the fan, is speaking a language older than words, one you've only just begun to study. Welcome to the secret code of Victorian accessories. You thought the love letters were subtle? That was nothing. This is espionage with lace and parasols. A silent, elegant Morse code fluttering behind every social interaction. Her fan flutters once, closes, then rests gently against her cheek. You freeze. Was that a signal? You have no idea. But you're pretty sure something just happened. Because yes, in the glorious theatre of Victorian flirtation, every accessory is a potential message board. Fans, gloves, parasols, even the way a lady handles her handkerchief can send a message that would be too scandalous to say out loud, or even whisper. And the best part, everyone knows it, or at least they pretend they do. You stroll closer, careful not to appear overeager. As you pass, she lifts her fan and covers her face just briefly, eyes peeking over the top. That's not shyness, that's strategy. According to one of those oh-so-serious etiquette manuals, hiding behind a fan might mean, follow me. Or it could mean, my mother is nearby, abort. Or possibly just, there's a bee. Context is everything, and unfortunately your training is limited to hearsay and wishful thinking. Historical fact. In the mid to late 1800s, the idea of a language of the fan became hugely popular. There were even printed guides, tiny decorative booklets, that listed dozens of supposed gestures and their meanings. Holding the fan to the right cheek meant yes. Left cheek? No. Twirling it in the left hand meant, we are being watched. Dropping it to the floor? I love you. Though honestly, with how clumsy some people are, that last one probably led to some very confusing conversations. She twirls the parasol next. Slowly, casually. That could mean she's uninterested, or just bored of this conversation about the garden's new trellis. You consider twirling yours too, but decide against it. Too risky, plus you'd probably smack a child by accident. Fringe fact time. Some elite ladies had bespoke fans painted with inside jokes or flirty images meant only for close friends, or observant suitors. They would flash them open mid-conversation, letting a suggestive image briefly peek through the folds before snapping it shut again. Like a Victorian version of a meme, a silent joke, a private dare. Now, there's some debate among historians about just how seriously people took this whole accessory code. Was it truly a widespread language of lovers, or more of a fun fiction perpetuated by magazines and bored debutantes? Some scholars argue it was mostly fantasy, an idealised version of flirtation that rarely played out in real life. But others suggest that even if it wasn't codified like Morse, the general idea of using body language and props to communicate forbidden feelings was very real, and very much practiced. Back in the garden, the conversation lingers politely on weather, music, and that awful shade of mauve the hostess insists on using for every cushion. You're standing just close enough to notice that her fan is made of peacock feathers and ivory spokes. Far too fine for casual use. She clearly chose it on purpose. For you, perhaps? Then she lowers the fan again, slowly this time, her eyes locked on yours for just a heartbeat longer than is polite. There it is. Actual, undeniable chemistry. No accessory handbook needed. You glance down, pretend to brush something off your glove, just to give her space to recover the moment. This is how the game is played. Not in declarations, not even in letters, but in these tiny explosive moments where neither of you says anything, and everything happens anyway. Suddenly an older gentleman interrupts, asking if she's read the latest sermon by the bishop of wherever. The moment evaporates. You step back, offer a short bow, and move on before overstaying your welcome. But inside you're buzzing. That fan flick meant something. That look meant something. You replay it over and over as you drift toward the lemonade table. And it's not just women using props. Men have their own arsenal, walking sticks, cravats, gloves, cufflinks. That slight tilt of the top hat might mean confidence, or arrogance, or a poorly tied ribbon, and everyone notices. You're a walking resume, every accessory screaming your intentions louder than you ever could. Why else do you think your boots were polished for an hour this morning? The challenge is interpreting it all. Sometimes a glance is just a glance. Sometimes a fan flutter is just a hot wrist. But other times, when the mood shifts, and the space between you stretches taut like a violin string, you know. The sun is setting now, turning the garden golden. You glance back once, just in time to see her glance at you, then quickly away. That flicker, that too quick denial. That's the signal you were waiting for. No fan guide needed. Later that night you write it down in your journal like some codebreaker in love. Peacock fan, left cheek, twirl, 3 glances, 1 smile. It reads like nonsense. But to you, it's poetry. You barely know her. That's the honest truth. You've danced with her 3 times, exchanged 5 letters, survived 2 garden parties, and now you're standing in your bedroom staring at your reflection, wondering if it's too soon to propose marriage. And the wild thing? It's not. In fact, by Victorian standards, you're practically moving at a glacial pace. Most people in your social circle expect engagements to be announced after only a handful of proper interactions and anything longer than a few months. That's suspiciously leisurely. Welcome to the bizarrely accelerated, and sometimes terrifyingly transactional timeline of Victorian courtship. The goal isn't to get to know each other. The goal is to find someone respectable, wealthy, or at least not dirt poor, well-connected, and unlikely to embarrass you at dinner. Fall in love after the wedding, preferably while producing 3 to 6 children and hosting tea parties. You try to imagine what a normal person might feel. Excitement? Terror? Both? You've been advised by nearly everyone in your family. Your uncle suggests proposing as soon as possible, before someone else does. Your sister warns you to be sure because scandalous engagements are harder to escape than they look. And your grandmother? She just sighs, sips her port and mutters something about, "Back in my day we had to court with a candle and a prayer." The thing is, there is something there. A feeling. A warmth in her letters. A quick wit in her glances. The way she remembered your dog's name in passing. You don't not like her. You even like her voice, which is a huge win considering you might be hearing it every day for the rest of your life. So maybe you're not just playing by the rules, maybe you're ready? Historical fact. Many Victorian engagements happened extremely quickly. For the middle and upper classes, once a courtship had received parental approval, and a few boxes were ticked, such as social compatibility, sufficient dowry, and minimal personal scandal, an engagement was announced within weeks. Months, if you were feeling cautious. Love was important, but it wasn't always required up front. You had a lifetime to warm up to each other. Of course, if you were poor, things looked a little different. The working class often didn't marry until they could afford to, which meant long engagements, sometimes years, and a whole lot of saving up. But you're in that middle-class sweet spot where emotions and economics meet like two uncomfortable dance partners forced to waltz. The actual proposal, by the way, is supposed to be a very serious event. It's not spontaneous. No getting down on one knee in the street, no singing telegrams. You're expected to ask her father's permission first. So now you're seated across from the man who controls the fate of your romantic life, and he's swirling his brandy like he's deciding whether you're worth marrying into the family name. You give the speech you practiced. You talk about your position, your income, your intentions. You avoid phrases like, "I think I like her," and replace them with things like, "I believe we are well suited." He listens, says little, then finally gives a slow, considered nod. Permission granted. You don't know if you want to vomit or buy a ring. Fringe fact, some men carried a written proposal with them, just in case. A literal proposal letter in their coat pocket, which could be passed along if nerves got in the way of speech. Nothing quite like offering your heart in 200 words or less while trying not to sweat through your waistcoat. Now comes the nerve-wracking part. You've scheduled a visit. You arrive at her house, flowers in hand, heart somewhere near your kneecaps. You're ushered into the parlour where she's seated, already aware of why you're here. No one else is in the room. Chaperones apparently make themselves scarce for this one moment. You sit down, you make small talk. You mention the weather, her piano playing, your dog again, because honestly you're panicking. Then you clear your throat, take a deep breath, and say it. Or sort of say it. Something like, "Miss Westing, if it would not be too forward of me to express." Well, that is to say, I would be honoured if you might consider. She watches you, unmoving, face unreadable. You continue, fumbling through your well-rehearsed speech until the final words tumble out. A proposal of marriage, plain and clear. You wait, heart beating like a frantic metronome, and then she smiles. Not just politely. It's that same warm, slightly crooked smile she gave you when you tripped over your words the first time you met. She nods, softly. She says she'd be honoured. You black out a little. She says she'll speak to her parents, of course, and you both know they've already decided, probably weeks ago. But still, it's official. You're engaged, betrothed, spoken for. And it's only been, 7 weeks? That's practically conservative. Now here's where the scholarly debate kicks in. Was this whirlwind engagement process romantic, or did it set people up for disappointment? Some historians argue that the fast pace created more stable unions, since choices were practical and aligned with social goals. Others claim it led to emotionally barren marriages where love was assumed to follow duty, but didn't always arrive. It's impossible to say which is more accurate. Both stories happened. Some couples fell in love slowly like a fire built from embers. Others fizzled by year 2 and spent the rest of their lives talking to separate potted plants. You leave the house with a ring on order and a heart full of cautious joy. The sky looks brighter. The air smells like a new future. You pass 2 children skipping rope on the sidewalk and suddenly feel old, responsible and mildly terrified. But you're engaged. And in this era, that means you're halfway to becoming a fully respectable adult. Marriage is the goal. Everything else, the fan flirtation, the letters, the dances, they all led here. Only 20 more steps and you're a husband. The smell hits you before you even step off the tram. A thick haze of coal smoke, fried something or other, and the unmistakable tang of a nearby tannery. Welcome to the other side of Victorian courtship, not the candlelit parlours and polished shoes, but the crowded tenements and factory whistles where dating looks very different, if it exists at all. You're not in Mayfair anymore. You're in Manchester, or Glasgow, or one of 100 industrial towns where the air is more soot than oxygen, and wages are measured by the day. Down here, romance doesn't involve calling cards or embroidered dance cards. Here, if you like someone, you say hello on the walk to work. If you're really bold, you carry their lunch pail for a block or 2. No parasols, no peacock fans, just eye contact, cracked hands, and shared bread rolls. The class divide in Victorian romance is massive. The middle and upper classes followed strict etiquette manuals, governed by appearances and lineage. But among the working class, things were looser, messier, and more immediate. Life was hard. People married young, often without permission, often because they had to. You find yourself near a textile mill. It's the end of the day, and the workers are pouring out, mostly young women, mostly exhausted. Hair pinned back, boots scuffed, dresses patched and practical. A few young men hover nearby, straightening their collars, pretending they just happen to be there. You see one approach a girl. He grins. She rolls her eyes, but she's smiling too. They walk off together, dodging puddles and horse droppings, probably heading toward a pub or a park bench with a halfway decent view of the canal. That's what a date looks like here. Historical fact. Among the working class, courtship was often informal, and relationships formed out of shared labour, proximity, and practicality. Young people met at work, in church, at fairs, or during Sunday strolls, one of the only socially acceptable ways to spend time together. Without drawing rooms or garden parties, courting couples had to be creative, finding privacy in alleys, fields, or stairwells. Romantic? Not exactly. Real? Absolutely. The difference is more than just scenery. It's about stakes. For middle-class couples, a bad match was a social inconvenience. For working-class people, it could be the difference between surviving or slipping into poverty. A woman might choose a husband based on who had stable work, a dry room to rent, and a mother who didn't hate her on sight. Love was ideal, but survival came first. You wander past a row of narrow homes, terraced houses stacked like bricks, their chimneys wheezing out black smoke. A young couple leans against a wall sharing a cigarette. She laughs, and he shifts closer, brushing a coal-smudged knuckle against her shoulder. No one's watching them. No chaperones here. Not because there's more freedom, just fewer resources. Parents are busy working. Grandparents are sick. Neighbours are too preoccupied with their own messes to care if a young couple kisses in the shadows. Fringe fact. There was a peculiar tradition in some mining towns where couples would walk out together as a sign of serious intent. If you were walking out with someone, it meant you were exclusive, often signalled by wearing a gift from the other person, like a ribbon or a handkerchief. In some areas, the term was used with the same gravity as engaged, even if no formal proposal had happened yet. Now here's the ongoing scholarly debate. Was working-class romance more authentic because it lacked the artificial etiquette of the upper classes, or was it just shaped by a different kind of pressure? Some historians argue that love among the poor had more room to breathe, free from the rigid structures of inherited wealth and parental matchmaking. Others point out that lack of choice and financial hardship could force people into unhappy unions just as often as the upper classes forced people into suitable ones. Love didn't always win, but then it rarely does in any class, does it? You step into a narrow pub. It's loud, dim, and smells strongly of hops and the damp wool of a dozen coats. In the corner, a girl is singing, off-key but heartfelt, while a young man watches with obvious affection. They're not engaged, might never be, but in that moment, over shared cider and candlelight, they have something. Back outside, the streets are quieting. Lamps are being lit, carts rumble by, and in a small courtyard, you spot two lovers sitting on a bench, close enough to touch but not quite daring to. You can tell by the way their knees angle toward each other, by the way they speak in murmurs, that this is one of the only quiet moments they get. He probably works 12 hours a day. She might be looking after younger siblings or mending clothes for a living. But tonight, for an hour, they're just two people trying to figure each other out. You begin to see it clearly now. The romance in the resilience, the beauty in small gestures. A scarf shared against the wind. A walk that loops past a house twice just to spend more time together. No one's checking your lineage or your net worth. No one cares if your hat is last season. You just have to like each other, and maybe laugh a little. That's the real difference. Among the rich, courtship is a negotiation of assets, bloodlines, and public image. But down here, in the soot and song, it's about finding someone you can trust. Someone who won't run when things get hard. Someone who will hold your hand in the dark and mean it. You walk on, past the couples, past the laughter, past the smell of dinner stews drifting from open windows. It's messy, loud, often unfair. But it's also kind of beautiful. And tomorrow, they'll do it all again. You're back in the drawing room. It's warm, overly so, the fire crackling as if someone's trying to melt the entire social hierarchy into goo. You've been invited to another family gathering, technically a tea, but don't be fooled. This isn't about refreshments. This is a test. You're not here for the scones. You're here to be judged. Enter Aunt Gertrude. You don't know who gave her this much power, but she walks into the room like a Victorian emperor in widow's black, trailing a cloud of lavender and stern disapproval. She doesn't sit. She arrives in a chair, looking you up and down like you're a particularly disappointing pudding. She asks no questions at first. She doesn't need to. Her face is already asking all of them. This is the other side of Victorian courtship: scrutiny. The relentless, exhausting expectation that you not only be eligible, but respectable. That you come from the right stock, hold the right opinions, walk at the right pace, and never under any circumstances put milk in your tea before the water. The room is full of these quiet, watchful figures, relatives and acquaintances who don't speak so much as evaluate. You smile, offer compliments, laugh politely. You're careful not to speak too much or too little. You're playing a role, the potential fiancé, and you better get your lines right. Historical fact: Victorian families, especially in the middle and upper classes, had enormous influence over courtship decisions. Marriage was a family affair, not just a personal one. Aunts, uncles, siblings, and even family friends could weigh in heavily. If your intended's great-aunt didn't approve, that disapproval could echo through the grapevine until suddenly no one was returning your letters. It wasn't personal, it was social survival. Aunt Gertrude finally speaks. She asks what your opinions are on land reform. Land reform? You weren't expecting political discourse with your biscuits, but you stumble through a vague, non-offensive answer about stability and the virtues of slow change. She sniffs. It's unclear whether you passed. Next, she asks about your family's history. Not your parents, your great-grandparents. She wants to know if your bloodline has any embarrassing hiccups, like tradesmen, actors, or, heaven forbid, people who were born somewhere that isn't England. You mention your grandfather was a solicitor. She frowns. Not ideal, but survivable. Fringe fact: some families kept informal, black books of undesirable suitors, a sort of social blacklist. If someone was known to be flirtatious, broke, or too closely associated with scandal, they might find themselves quietly uninvited to gatherings, their calling cards returned, their names removed from guest lists. All without confrontation. You just disappeared. As Aunt Gertrude moves on to interrogate someone else, you realise how deeply entwined marriage is with status. This isn't just about finding a wife. It's about being absorbed into a family machine, a reputation engine that has no room for defects. You're not marrying one person. You're marrying into an entire ecosystem of expectations, secrets, and Christmas obligations. She, your intended, gives you a glance from across the room. She rolls her eyes slightly, just enough to say, "I know, I'm sorry." It's a tiny act of rebellion, and it gives you hope. But still you feel the weight, the pressure. Even if she wants to marry you, she can't do it without her family's blessing. Not really. Oh sure, people can elope, though that's considered outrageous and deeply scandalous, but most don't. Most bend to the current. They wait, they try harder, they nod and smile and promise to read up on land reform. This brings us to the debate. Was all this family involvement about protection or control? Some historians argue that families were just looking out for their own, trying to ensure that women, especially, married someone who could support them, who wouldn't turn out to be a drunkard or a debtor. Others suggest it was about maintaining the social order, guarding class boundaries like sentries on a crumbling wall. A mix of both, probably. But the result is the same. Love comes second to legacy. You excuse yourself to fetch another cup of tea and catch two cousins whispering about you in the hallway. One likes your hair, the other thinks your boots are scuffed. You want to scream, or run, or disappear into the garden and never return. But you don't. You smile, re-enter the drawing room, and rejoin the performance. Aunt Gertrude catches your eye again. She's smiling this time. Not warmly, but with a certain grim approval, like someone who's decided you're not entirely useless. You might just make the cut. Congratulations. You sit beside your intended now, both of you under the scrutiny of 6 different relatives pretending to read the newspaper. She asks if you'd like to walk out with her after tea. Walk out. The term means something. It's halfway to a formal engagement, a declaration of intention. You nod, a little stunned, and her smile flickers. Genuine, almost shy. You think of the others who never made it this far. Suitors who wore the wrong colour waistcoat, who laughed too loudly, who dared to mention divorce laws or modern poetry. This world is filled with invisible tripwires, and somehow you haven't tripped them all. Yet. You take the tea, you eat the biscuits, you sit through the rest of the afternoon nodding politely, making inoffensive comments, and pretending not to notice that everyone is still judging you. Always. Even the dog looks suspicious. But when she squeezes your arm gently as you rise to go, it feels worth it. Because behind all the layers of decorum and scrutiny in Aunt Gertrude's terrifying monocle glare, there's something real starting to bloom. And that's the part no one can control. It happens fast. Too fast. One minute you're sitting with her on a shady bench making awkward conversation about gooseberry tarts and whether they're overrated. The next, she's gone, bolted from the garden, her hat still dangling from your fingertips, and you're running after her like you've both just escaped from a Jane Austen prison. Because you have. In a way. You've escaped expectations, surveillance, and the looming presence of Aunt Gertrude, who definitely just fainted into a rhododendron bush. Congratulations, you're eloping, or at least you're trying. Victorian elopement isn't like a modern romantic getaway. There's no Las Vegas, no Elvis impersonator. There's fog, train tickets, and a bag packed in secret. There's scandal, heartbreak, and usually at least one very angry father involved. You're probably heading for Scotland, Gretna Green to be specific. A sleepy little border town that became the go-to destination for couples who didn't have time for permission. You're both breathless as you hop into a hired carriage, the coachman giving you a look that says, "Again? It's not even Wednesday." Your intended adjusts her bonnet, face flushed with adrenaline. This is the most daring thing either of you has ever done, and the carriage hasn't even left the lane yet. Historical fact. Gretna Green became famous in the 18th and 19th centuries as a safe haven for runaway lovers, because Scottish law allowed for irregular marriages. Basically, if two people declared themselves husband and wife in front of a witness, even a blacksmith, that was legally binding. No parental consent, no required waiting periods. Just love, bad timing, and enough coin to rent a room for the night. You rattle northward, clutching her gloved hand like it might disappear. Each mile that rolls beneath the carriage wheels feels both exhilarating and terrifying. Are you really doing this? Have you lost your mind? Probably. But isn't that the point? She grins at you, nervously, excitedly. You grin back. In this moment, it's just the two of you. No ballrooms, no calling cards, no embroidery needle eyes tracking your every move. Just a bumpy road, a shared bag of shortbread, and a plan so outrageous it might actually work. And now, a fringe fact for you. Sometimes, elopements were staged. Not just by the couple, but by the families themselves. In certain cases, parents would pretend to disapprove of a match just to create the drama of a scandalous elopement, knowing full well the couple was running off with full blessing and the money to pay for it. Nothing spices up a wedding like a bit of manufactured rebellion. But that's not your story. Yours is very real, and it's also very risky. If you're caught before reaching the border, your intended could be dragged home and locked in a parlour until the end of time. Or worse, married off to someone pre-approved. You could be sued for breach of promise, defamation, or simply being a scandalous influence, whatever that means. And trust. Victorian courts were more than happy to pile on the consequences. Scholars debate the real motive behind most elopements. Was it passion, desperation, rebellion? Some believe it was the only escape route for people who loved across class lines or religious boundaries. Others think it was a youthful fantasy, spurred by too many Gothic novels and too few rational conversations. Whatever the truth, one thing is clear. Eloping wasn't just running to someone, it was running from something. From control, from disapproval, from a life already scripted by someone else. Back in the carriage, the landscape changes as you near the border. The countryside is all fog-draped fields and stone walls now, sheep bleating like they've seen this romantic mess before. You both nod off for a bit, elopement is exhausting, and wake up when the wheels crunch into the gravel outside the inn. You step out into the cold Scottish air. She shivers, and you offer your coat, because even in the middle of social chaos, chivalry persists. You're met by a man in a soot-streaked apron, the blacksmith. The unofficial officiant of desperate love. He's married thousands of couples, probably has no idea what any of their names were. But tonight, you're the only two that matter. Inside, the ceremony's brief. A few words spoken, hands clasped, a witness scribbling names. That's it. You're married. Illegally romantic. Romantically illegal. Legally enough. You both laugh suddenly in that giddy way you do when all the tension bursts and you're left with nothing but joy and disbelief. She's still holding your hand. You're still wearing your best boots, now covered in mud. It's not glamorous, but it is yours. There's no champagne, no cake, just cold tea and a room upstairs with a creaky bed and wallpaper peeling at the edges. She takes off her gloves. You unbutton your collar. You sit in silence for a moment, side by side, listening to the wind outside rattle the shutters. This is marriage now, not the theoretical kind from the letters and dances, the real kind, with cold feet, stolen hours, and all the messy stuff still ahead. You don't know what comes next. Maybe her family will forgive you. Maybe they'll cut you both off forever. Maybe society will find something juicier to gossip about by Thursday. Or maybe you'll live quietly, growing old together, still laughing about the time Aunt Gertrude threatened to duel you with a fireplace poker. But for now, you're here, married. Wildly, wonderfully, rebelliously married. And as you lie awake in the unfamiliar dark, your hand resting on hers, you realise this might be the first moment since this whole ridiculous courtship began that you feel completely free. The wedding night isn't what you expected, or maybe you didn't know what to expect. That's the thing, isn't it? No one told you anything. Not your father, who gave you a stiff handshake and a copy of Proverbs. Not your mother, who blushed and said, "You'll figure it out, dear." Not the dusty stack of etiquette books you skimmed last week, which were too busy describing how to serve roast duck to guests without crying to mention anything about sex. Which, by the way, you still can't say out loud. You're married now. That much is clear. She's sitting at the edge of the narrow bed, carefully undoing the dozens of pins holding her hair in place. You're standing by the window, unsure what to do with your hands or your existence. You've shared dances, letters, a runaway carriage, and even a last name. But intimacy? That's a whole other beast. This is uncharted territory for both of you, and Victorian society didn't exactly hand out maps. Because let's be honest, sex education in the 19th century was, well, non-existent. If you were lucky, someone hinted at the duties of a wife, or the natural expectations of a husband, all while refusing to elaborate. The general assumption was that you'd just know what to do when the time came. Instinct, biology, divine inspiration, who knows? But the result? Two nervous people in a poorly lit room, trying not to make eye contact with the chamber pot. Historical fact. Victorian-era sex education was deliberately vague and often dangerously misleading. Many women entered marriage with no understanding of reproduction, anatomy, or even the basic mechanics of sex. Some believed pregnancy could happen from kissing. Some thought the marital act required a doctor's supervision. And more than a few went to bed on their wedding night thinking they'd simply hold hands and pray. Your new wife, your actual wife, glances at you and smiles. It's a soft, tired smile, 1 part affection, and 3 parts mortal terror. You sit beside her, unsure how to begin, how to even talk about the thing neither of you is allowed to say. Here's the fringe fact. There was an entire underground network of pamphlets and so-called marriage guides that offered varying degrees of information, some helpful, some absurd. Titles like The Wedding Night Explained, or For the Newlywed Gentleman's Consideration were printed in small batches, often distributed discreetly by mail or whispered about behind closed curtains. Some were medical, some were not. One infamous booklet promised to help a man awaken the flower of passion within his delicate bride, and then immediately advised him to avoid spicy food to maintain moral clarity. You lean back slightly, laugh under your breath. She does too. You both know how ridiculous this is. 2 adults married by law and custom and yet completely in the dark. Your fingers brush hers. That counts for something. There's a scholarly debate here worth noting. Was Victorian ignorance about sex intentional, or just the result of a culture too repressed to speak plainly? Some historians argue it was part of a wider system of control, especially over women, keeping them uninformed and docile. Others believe it was simply the unfortunate byproduct of centuries of moralistic squeamishness. Either way, the damage was real. Confusion, fear, even trauma, especially for brides who'd never been warned about what to expect. You look at her again. She's taken off her shoes now, unfastened the top button of her gown. Still no rush, still no pressure. You speak softly, and she speaks back, and eventually, between all the fear and fumbling in candlelight, something shifts. There's a slowness to it, a tenderness that has nothing to do with expertise and everything to do with trust. No one told you what this would be like, so you write it yourselves, moment by uncertain moment, and it's clumsy. Let's be honest. Awkward, sweet. Maybe a little disappointing, maybe not. You're figuring out each other's bodies the same way you figured out how to dance. One step at a time, not always in rhythm. There's laughter, there's a bit of frustration, there's a definite learning curve. But there's also something kind underneath it all. A quiet sense that you're not being graded. That love, even if it's not roaring just yet, is somewhere in the room with you, quietly building its nest in the corner. You fall asleep beside each other, not touching at first, then inching closer as the night cools. Her breath slows. Yours does too. You're still not sure what's next. You've crossed a threshold without a guidebook. You might be brilliant at this marriage thing, or absolutely terrible. Either way, you're in it now. And no, it's not a storybook romance. It's not fireworks and orchestras and sweeping declarations. It's two people figuring out how to exist together, stripped of etiquette and gloves and fan codes. It's messier than a letter, more real than a dance. And somehow that's more romantic than anything you read in those crumbling advice manuals. The morning veil rustles softly as it drapes across her lap, catching the pale morning light that filters through the lace-curtained window. It's day 12 of her mourning period, and by now you've memorised the precise crepe pattern of her dress, how the black silk catches the light just enough to suggest wealth, but not so much as to imply she's enjoying anything. Because in Victorian society, even grief had a dress code, and let's be honest, it was exhausting. She's not your wife, not yet anyway. But she might have been if the timing had been different. Or maybe she still could be. The problem is her uncle just died. Or was it her cousin? Regardless, it was someone important enough to trigger full mourning protocol, and now everything about her world, and yours, is on pause. Victorian romance didn't stop for death. It tiptoed around it. Mourning wasn't just a feeling, it was a job. And depending on your relationship to the deceased, you might be in mourning for a year or more. That means no parties, no dancing, no colourful dresses, no laughing too loudly, and definitely no engagement announcements. Courtship becomes a slow-motion waltz through grief-soaked parlours and whispered condolences. She offers you tea with gloved hands. Even her gloves are black. So is the ribbon in her hair. So is the thread used to monogram her mourning handkerchief, which she dabs at her eyes with in a way that suggests sorrow, but not devastation. You've noticed she dabs more often when certain people are around. You can't blame her. The neighbours are watching. Historical fact. Queen Victoria set the tone for mourning after the death of Prince Albert in 1861. She wore black for the rest of her life, over 40 years, and effectively institutionalised elaborate grieving practices across British society. Suddenly, everyone needed to own multiple layers of black clothing, change them in stages, and follow strict timelines. There was full mourning, half mourning, deep mourning, second mourning, each with different rules, different hemlines, and different levels of acceptable embroidery. The problem? Love didn't care about dress codes. You've been sneaking visits to the edge of her garden, just far enough to be respectable but close enough for conversation. Your letters continue, more subdued now, filled with poetry about time and loss and the healing power of nature. You've toned down the Byron, upped the Wordsworth. It's a delicate dance. But here's the quiet truth. Mourning had its own kind of intimacy. The restrictions, the slowness, the shared silence. It built a different kind of connection. You learn to speak with fewer words, to notice more in the spaces between. When she lowers her veil to look at you directly, just for a moment, it feels like a lightning bolt through the fog. Fringe fact, some people sent mourning valentines, black-bordered cards with poems that blended romance and grief. Imagine getting a note that says, "My heart mourns your absence as I mourn poor Aunt Margaret." Morbid? Yes. Sincere? Surprisingly, yes. Victorian culture was weirdly comfortable with blending love and death, perhaps because they were so constantly intertwined. You walk together now at the cemetery, not for a date, of course, for air. Her chaperone is nearby, but lingering behind, suddenly invested in a patch of lilies that need extensive examination. The cemetery is quiet, peaceful, and oddly romantic. It's one of the only places you can be alone-ish and unhurried. You walk slowly, your arms almost brushing, as she tells you about the person she lost. And for once, you're not thinking about your posture or your phrasing. You're just there, present, listening, offering her your silence, your steadiness. It's the most honest connection you've had so far. Now here's the debate. Were mourning customs genuinely about emotional healing? Or were they just another form of social policing, especially for women? Scholars are divided. Some argue that the strict rules provided structure, allowing people to move through grief with a sense of order. Others point out how the system disproportionately burdened women who were expected to perform sadness in layers of wool and restriction, while men could often slip back into public life with a black armband and a conveniently sombre expression. You watch her now, eyes on the headstones. She's telling a story about her cousin who used to sing off-key at family dinners. She laughs, just a little, then catches herself, pressing her lips closed as though joy itself might be disrespectful. You say nothing. You just walk beside her. That's how it is for a while. Days turn into weeks. The official mourning period drags on like a winter that forgets it's supposed to end. But quietly, slowly, your connection deepens. There's a tenderness in how she looks at you now, a kind of gratefulness you didn't expect. You bring her violets one afternoon. Technically, still within the rules, violets are acceptable, symbolic of modesty and remembrance. She accepts them with a soft thank you, her fingers lingering just a moment too long on yours. You don't talk about the future yet. That would be improper, but you both feel it circling. It's there, waiting patiently, like spring. Eventually she begins to wear grey instead of black, then lavender, then a ribbon of pale blue. The stages of mourning are like phases of the moon, hard to track unless you're paying close attention. You are. And when she finally invites you to tea again, this time with music in the background and her cousin playing a gentle waltz on the pianoforte, you realise something. The mourning is lifting. Not gone, not forgotten, but lighter, and in its place. Room for something else, something hopeful. You take your seat beside her. She smiles, not the polite one, the real one. And in that moment, the world feels full of possibility again. It's all anyone can talk about. Not the weather, not the price of tea, not even the new steam omnibus service. No, every conversation in your social circle has, without fail, swerved into the subject of Her Majesty Queen Victoria and her late husband, Prince Albert. Again. Because in this era, there is no such thing as a private royal relationship. Their marriage was everyone's business, and their love story. A public template stretched thin over every dinner table, sermon and disappointed parent trying to guilt their child into marrying for duty like Victoria did. You see it everywhere. Portraits of Victoria and Albert, young, luminous, painfully formal, framed in parlours across the country, like some divine couple frozen in respectable devotion. She adored him, they say. He civilised her, they say. They were soulmates, they say. The subtext is loud and clear. This is what love should look like. Anything less? Try harder. Which is fine, except their story is complicated. You remember the first time you saw that iconic sketch of the two of them dancing together at a royal ball? Her face soft, his eyes fixed on her like she hung the moon. It's all very poetic until you realise Albert was her first cousin, and their early letters were half love notes, half royal policy debates. So, yes, romance, but with a thick layer of administrative efficiency. Historical fact. Victoria and Albert married in 1840, and while they genuinely seemed to love each other deeply, their marriage was not without its frictions. Albert was often frustrated by his lack of formal power, while Victoria had to reconcile her role as monarch with her role as wife and mother, something Victorian society found slightly scandalous. Imagine being both the Queen of England and a woman told to stay quiet during dinner. It was a lot. But the myth of their love quickly outpaced the reality. After Albert's death in 1861, Victoria dove headfirst into mourning, wearing black for the rest of her life, and retreating from public duties for years. She had statues built, rooms preserved, letters locked away like sacred relics. Her grief wasn't just personal, it was monumental. It rewrote what it meant to be a widow. It codified what true love should look like, dramatic, enduring, and conveniently unattainable for the rest of us. Fringe fact, Victoria had a lock of Albert's hair sewn into nearly every article of clothing she wore for decades. She even had his shaving kit placed beside her every morning, as if he might walk back into the room and ask for a trim. Some say she never recovered. Others say she just knew how to commit to the bit. Now here's the awkward part. Because of all this royal spectacle, Your own romantic efforts are being measured against a literal queen. When you write a love letter, someone inevitably says, "Well, Prince Albert once composed an entire melody for Victoria's birthday." When you take your partner on a walk through the garden, someone reminds you that Albert landscaped whole royal estates as love offerings. You show up with violets, and some older cousin sighs, "Albert gave her an emerald brooch in 1845, you know." Yes, Aunt Maud, we know. It's not just exhausting, it's impossible. You can't compete with a legend, and more importantly, you shouldn't have to, because real relationships are messy. You forget anniversaries, you bicker about wallpaper, you burn the scones. There's no oil painting of that moment, no statue in Hyde Park depicting that time you argued about who left the front gate unlatched. But those things are love too. There's an ongoing scholarly debate about whether Victoria's grand mourning was an expression of authentic grief or a strategic tool. Some argue she genuinely couldn't bear life without Albert. Others point out how her prolonged seclusion conveniently kept her critics at bay, letting her wield power from the shadows. Either way, the end result was the same. A nation drowning in black crape and unrealistic expectations. You sit with your beloved now, thankfully alive, thankfully not a statue, and talk about the Queen. You joke about sending each other brooches in the shape of your favourite condiments. You tease her by pretending to speak in overly dramatic Victorian prose. "My dearest cucumber of my affection, thou art the condiment of my heart's longing." She nearly chokes on her tea laughing, and that's the thing. You laugh together. Albert and Victoria probably did too, but nobody painted that. Nobody wrote the love story about the time Albert tripped over a footstool and Victoria snorted. Because it doesn't fit the myth. But your love, your real, slightly awkward, deeply imperfect, endearingly human love, it lives in those unscripted moments. The ones that don't get written down. The ones that wouldn't look good in a portrait but would absolutely make someone smile. So yes, Victoria and Albert were romantic, tragic, monumental, but they were also human, just like you. And maybe the best way to honour that is not by imitating their grief, but by fully embracing your own little, joyful, everyday kind of love. No statues required, you're standing in front of a bookshelf. Not the fancy kind, mind you. This one's slightly wobbly, stained with teacup rings, and probably rescued from a cousin's attic. But it's crammed full of slim volumes with titles like The Gentleman's Guide to Deportment and A Lady's Mirror of Manners, all with gilded lettering and that distinctive Victorian smell. Paper, ink, and just a whisper of judgment. This is where things start to feel a little surreal, because apparently if you want to succeed in love during this era, you're supposed to read manuals about it. Literally. Books that tell you what to say, how to stand, which facial expressions are permitted on a promenade, and how often you're allowed to laugh before someone accuses you of emotional instability. You're flipping through one now, and it is a masterpiece of passive-aggressive instruction. A line jumps out. "A gentleman must neither hover nor loiter, but present his interest with the practised elegance of a leaf falling to earth." What does that mean? Are you supposed to flirt like an autumn tree? Is there a diagram? The entire book reads like someone invited Emily Post and a slightly disapproving librarian to co-author a rulebook for polite agony. There are chapters on glove etiquette, how to hold a teacup without appearing eager, how to convey admiration without being vulgar, which apparently means no eyebrow raising ever. You're learning so much. You're also developing a complex. Historical fact. Victorian etiquette manuals were wildly popular and covered everything from flirtation to funeral behaviour. These books were the influencers of their day, telling readers how to behave in every possible situation, especially in matters of courtship. Writers like Sarah Stickney Ellis, Florence Hartley, and Thomas E. Hill penned these guides with the absolute conviction that proper behaviour could shape character, prevent social disaster, and help you land a respectable spouse. Love wasn't just about feeling, it was about form. One particularly dramatic excerpt advises women, "Should a gentleman present a compliment, a lady must respond not with enthusiasm, but with tempered gratitude, lest she be thought eager or, God forbid, forward." So essentially, if someone calls you beautiful, you're meant to blink slowly and pretend you didn't hear it, or say how kind in the tone of someone rejecting an hors d'oeuvre. You find a section titled The Language of Posture. It explains how standing with your shoulders too far back makes you appear arrogant, but slouching is a moral failure. There is apparently a 27-degree angle at which you may tilt your head to appear charming without seeming unbalanced. And yes, there's a diagram. It's horrifying. Fringe fact, there were entire books devoted just to parlour games for flirtation, little tricks to engineer moments of closeness while technically following the rules. One guide suggested a game where couples were blindfolded and had to identify each other by handshake alone. Sounds sweet, right? Except another page warned that improper pressure during a handshake could imply undue familiarity. You couldn't win. You pass one of the books to your partner. She reads a few lines, smirks, and immediately impersonates the demure nod of the modest woman. It involves a complicated series of glances, chin dips, and an exhale that's meant to sound like a wind through reeds. You applaud, then try it yourself. You end up looking like you're having a small, elegant seizure. And yet, the charm of it is undeniable. The sheer earnestness with which these guides were written. They really believed there was a formula to love, that if you walked just right, wrote the correct kind of letter, and held your handkerchief at precisely the right angle, you'd unlock the secret to a perfect courtship. It's wildly naive and weirdly touching. Here's the debate among scholars. Were these manuals actually useful, or just another tool of control? Some argue they were a democratizing force, offering anyone, regardless of birth, a roadmap to polite society. Learn the rules, and you could blend in with the best of them. Others point out that they often reinforced rigid gender roles and class hierarchies. Women were told how to be modest, meek, and pleasing. Men were instructed to dominate conversations, politely of course, and always pay for everything, unless they wanted to be viewed as a human fungus. Still, there's something kind of comforting in it. Like a script for social situations you were never taught how to navigate. The same way people today Google how to flirt without being creepy, Victorian lovers turned to manuals that said, when uncertain, inquire about her feelings on rhubarb cultivation. Honestly, could be worse. You close the book. Your partner's still reading, now attempting a passage aloud in a voice that sounds suspiciously like Aunt Gertrude's. It's a section on the importance of silence, and it suggests that excessive speech from a woman disturbs the gentle music of domestic harmony. She reads that line 3 times, then bursts out laughing so hard she nearly spills her tea. You look at each other, the laughter lingering, the ridiculousness of it all softening the space between you. These books are absurd, but they're also a window into a world that tried, really tried, to make sense of love, to codify it, organize it, fold it neatly into chapters with subheadings and footnotes. But love doesn't follow instructions, not really. It spills over margins, smudges the ink, forgets the proper distance between elbows. It's messy and awkward, and often louder than society would like. And yet, here you are, still reading, still trying, because even the most ridiculous rules can't stop you from falling in love. They just give you something to laugh about along the way. You smell it before you see it. The warm, moist scent of humanity wrapped in starch and something vaguely medicinal, like a hospital that also sells scones. It wafts from parlours, clings to upholstery, drifts across the drawing room with alarming persistence, and you, now thoroughly embedded in the romantic dance of Victorian society, have finally realised something no etiquette manual ever dared to say outright. Everyone smells weird. No one talks about this part of courtship, but it's impossible to ignore once you notice. The mingled scents of sweat, wool, musty drapery, coal smoke and cologne strong enough to burn through wallpaper. You walk into a room and your nostrils are instantly assaulted by a fog of bergamot, hair tonic and breath that's been stewing in mutton fat since breakfast. Ah yes, love, Victorian style, not for the faint of nose. You try not to judge, everyone's doing their best. But personal hygiene in this era is, well, let's call it aspirational. Bathing is a luxury, not a daily ritual. You're lucky if your wash basin water isn't shared with 3 cousins and the family cat. And those beautiful layered gowns. They trap heat like greenhouses. After one dance, everyone smells like emotional repression and boiled undergarments. Historical fact, most Victorians didn't bathe daily. For many, a full bath was a weekly event, if that. And soap? It was available, yes, but harsh, heavily scented, and often filled with ingredients that left your skin either dry as parchment or suspiciously sticky. Deodorant as we know it didn't exist, and mouthwash was vinegar. Just vinegar. Fresh breath meant chewing on parsley or clove buds and praying no one noticed the onion in your stew. It's especially awkward when you're trying to be romantic. You lean in just slightly to whisper something sweet, and immediately regret it. Her perfume is lovely, but beneath it is a subtle hint of damp linen and the ghost of yesterday's goose fat. You pretend not to notice. She pretends not to notice the faint scent of horse from your boots. Everyone agrees, silently, to never speak of it. Fringe fact, some women would carry small bouquets of aromatic herbs, called posies or tussie-musses, not just for decoration but for olfactory survival. These little bundles of lavender, rosemary and mint were practically nasal shields, lifted discreetly to the face whenever a particularly pungent guest entered the room. Romantic? Not really. Necessary? Absolutely. Colognes and perfumes, of course, were wildly popular, but not exactly subtle. Men doused themselves in bay rum and sandalwood. Women wore heavy floral scents like rose, jasmine and musk. The result? Ballroom air so thick with fragrance you could practically chew it. One whiff, and you knew whether someone was wealthy, romantic, or recently embalmed. And here's the kicker. People fainted. A lot. Not just from tight corsets or unrequited love, but from the sheer overwhelming environment. Heat, lack of ventilation, physical exertion, emotional stress, and the occasional surprise whiff of unwashed armpit. It was a recipe for collapse. And when someone fainted, it was seen as delicate, romantic, an opportunity for a gentleman to swoop in dramatically and loosen a glove. Forget flowers. The fainting couch was the real symbol of courtship. Now for the scholarly debate. Was Victorian cleanliness really as bad as we think? Or are modern historians just obsessed with filth? Some argue the reputation for grimminess is exaggerated, especially among the wealthier classes who could afford frequent washing and clean linens. Others point out that even the wealthy lacked modern plumbing, temperature control and effective hygiene products, meaning that even clean people were still, by today's standards, a bit earthy. It's all relative. Back in your world, you're trying not to break into a visible sweat during a family dinner. You dressed in your best, applied a modest amount of hair pomade, and even remembered to wipe your boots. But the room is stifling, the roast beef is steaming, and you can feel your collar tightening like a noose. Across the table, your beloved looks equally flustered, gently patting her forehead with a handkerchief that smells vaguely of lavender and desperation. You share a glance, a knowing one. She fans herself with a menu. You discreetly pull at your collar. There's no escape from the heat, but somehow the shared discomfort feels oddly intimate. That's the strange charm of it all. Yes, it's sticky and sometimes unpleasant. But there's a vulnerability in being seen, really seen, without the glossy polish of ideal romance. You fall in love not just with someone's smile or handwriting, but with how they look slightly wilted after 3 dances, how they smell like too much rosewater, but you don't really mind. You start to associate certain scents with certain memories. Her perfume becomes tied to that moment in the garden. Your cologne reminds her of your first clumsy bow. Later that evening you walk her home. The night is cooler finally. The air smells less like people and more like damp earth and chimney smoke. She links her arm with yours, her cheek a little flushed, her breath warm in the chilly air. You don't say much, and for once everything smells right. The silence is louder than anything. You're seated in the drawing room staring at a teacup you haven't touched, listening to the ticking of the grandfather clock, the distant clatter of hooves outside, and the thundering noise in your head that says, "You've messed up royally." Across the room she's sitting very straight. Her eyes are fixed on the same teacup. Her mother, who is absolutely not pretending to be calm, is stabbing her embroidery with the kind of intensity usually reserved for ritual sacrifice. There's no music, no conversation, just tension so thick you could spread it on toast. You broke off the engagement, not dramatically, not even angrily. You were careful, kind, possibly too kind, which might have made it worse. You tried to explain that you felt uncertain, that you weren't ready, that maybe this wasn't the right match after all. You even tried that time-honoured classic. It's not you, it's Victorian social pressure, and also maybe you a little bit. None of it helped. Because in this world, breaking an engagement isn't just awkward, it's dangerous. Historical fact. In Victorian England, an engagement was not just a promise. It was a legally recognised agreement. If you broke it off, especially if you were the man, you could be sued. Actual court, with witnesses, and newspapers. There was a whole category of lawsuits called breach of promise, where the rejected party could claim financial damages for being led on. You might end up paying for lost social standing, wedding preparations, even emotional distress, though they didn't call it that. They called it loss of prospects. And the court loved a good scandal. There were newspaper columns dedicated to these trials, complete with courtroom sketches of jilted brides dabbing their eyes with black-bordered handkerchiefs, while jurors glared at some poor man in a waistcoat trying to explain that he just wasn't feeling it. Fringe fact, some women kept every letter, every note, and even receipts for gifts during courtship, just in case they needed evidence later. There were cases where love letters were read aloud in court to gasping audiences, lines like, "My heart is forever yours," suddenly becoming Exhibit A in a romantic crime scene. Imagine your worst text message being printed in the Times. That's the energy. Back in your now ex-fiancé's parlour, the tension is curdling. You've already explained yourself. Twice. The father has not emerged from his study, which is probably a good sign, or maybe a very bad one. No one knows. You attempt a final apology. It lands like a cold dumpling. The mother blinks twice, then mutters something about people forgetting their place, which you're pretty sure is not a compliment. You leave without being shown to the door, and here comes the real kicker. Your social standing is about to take a nosedive. Word spreads fast in these circles. You'll be whispered about at every gathering. Someone will say you broke her heart. Others will suggest you were never serious. One overly poetic family friend will call you a scoundrel of the worst moral flavour, and people will nod, even though no one knows what that means. This is where the scholarly debate comes in. Was the breach of promise law actually helpful for women, or just another patriarchal performance? Some historians argue it gave women legal recourse in a society where their options were painfully limited. If a woman lost her fiancé, she often lost her only shot at financial stability. These lawsuits were one of the few ways she could push back. But others point out that the public shaming often made things worse. The woman's name was dragged through the press alongside the man's, and even a successful lawsuit didn't always repair a damaged reputation. She might win the case and still lose in the court of public opinion. You retreat to your own parlour, exhausted. Your parents are supportive in the way Victorian parents are, that is, mildly disappointed, but not so much that they'll say it directly. Your mother brings you weak tea. Your father mutters that honesty is a virtue, but not always a useful one. Helpful. And then the letters begin. Not from her, of course, but from others, friends, acquaintances, distant cousins you forgot existed. Some offer comfort. Others are more like subtle accusations disguised as polite concern. One particularly venomous note from a concerned admirer includes the phrase emotional cowardice twice. Bold. You start avoiding social gatherings. You miss a few dances. You decline an invitation to a lakeside picnic with the grim awareness that you might accidentally run into someone's aunt and get hexed with a curse involving lukewarm jam. You've become that person. The one who broke it off. The one everyone tuts about behind fans and gloves. But there's another side to it. A quiet relief. You knew it wasn't right. Not really. You tried. You hoped. But beneath all the polite conversation and perfect curtsies and mutual admiration for chrysanthemums, there was a hollowness you couldn't ignore. A stiffness. The knowledge that you were two people playing at love because the roles were ready and the costumes fit. You weren't cruel. You were honest. And in this society, that might be the greatest scandal of all. Still, it lingers. The guilt. The what-ifs. You keep a few of her letters, tucked away in a drawer. You don't read them often. But sometimes, when the house is quiet and the rain taps against the window just so, you open one and trace the ink with your finger. She'll move on, so will you. The world is full of possibilities, even in corset-tightened lanes of social expectation. But for now, you carry the weight of a promise broken, one that, for a moment, meant everything. You thought Valentine's Day would be a welcome break from the tight-laced awkwardness of Victorian courtship. A little sweetness, a little poetry, a little heart-shaped indulgence. You imagined flowers, ribbons, and maybe, a note sealed with a wax heart and a flirtatious quote from Lord Byron. But then the first card arrived, and the second, and the third, and by the sixth you realise this is not a love letter. This is a roast. Because in Victorian England, Valentine's Day was not always romantic. It could be biting, it could be brutal, and it could absolutely, devastatingly be anonymous. You hold one such card now, fingers trembling slightly. The front is delicately illustrated. A pig in a top hat. Inside, the words, Your waistcoat is as loud as your laugh, both unbearable. A gentleman across the street received one picturing a monkey holding a bouquet, captioned, "Apes may mimic men, but you can't mimic manners." Welcome to the world of vinegar valentines. Historical fact. Starting in the mid-19th century, Valentine's Day exploded in popularity, partly thanks to cheaper printing and affordable postage. This led to a booming market not just for sentimental cards, but for satirical, sarcastic, and sometimes downright vicious ones. Vinegar valentines were mass-produced and sold for a penny apiece, making them the snarky greeting card of the era. Half gag gift, half social warfare. These weren't just silly, they were weapons. People sent them to ex-lovers, annoying neighbours, the town flirt, the overly religious, the scandalously immodest, and anyone else whose presence offended Victorian sensibilities. Often signed anonymously, they created chaos and paranoia in households across Britain. Because what's better than flowers and chocolate? Thinly veiled public humiliation. Fringe fact, some vinegar valentines were so offensive that the post office refused to deliver them. That's right. This was pre-internet trolling that was so mean even 19th century mailmen said, "Absolutely not." Still, many were sent, and opened, and read aloud, usually to much gasping and in some cases minor fainting. Back in your world, you've received 2 lovely valentines and 3 that could best be described as character assassinations in watercolour. One shows a man tripping over his own ego. Another accuses you of flirting like a circus parrot and warns, "No lady wants a suitor who talks more than sense." Your favourite is a drawing of a cake with a face, holding a crumbling top hat and the words, "Sweet on the outside, stale within." You suspect the last one came from someone's aunt, possibly Aunt Gertrude. The question is, what now? Do you respond? Pretend it didn't happen? Confront the artist? You consider your options while sipping lukewarm tea and trying to appear unbothered. But you are bothered. Not because the cards are cruel, but because they're not entirely wrong. You do talk too much when nervous. Your waistcoat choices have been described as ambitious. Still, it stings. You meet your beloved, your actual Valentine later that day in a garden that's more mud than roses. You expect laughter, maybe a little teasing, but instead, she hands you a small envelope with trembling fingers. Her eyes are wide. You open it, and your stomach drops. It's a vinegar valentine, addressed to her. The drawing shows a woman standing atop a pile of books labelled Flirtation, Vanity, Falsehood, with the caption, "Your intellect is far too loud. Try silence for a change." She looks devastated. You're furious, because this isn't just satire, this is targeted. It's not clever, it's cruel. And it says so much about the undercurrent of Victorian society, how it policed behaviour, especially for women who dared to be more than quiet, decorative furniture in a bonnet. Here's the debate among historians. Were vinegar valentines harmless fun, or social enforcement masked as humour? Some argue they allowed people to push back against hypocrisy and pretension. Others suggest they were a form of anonymous bullying, especially aimed at women who didn't conform to ideals of modesty or submissiveness. These cards weren't always punching up. Often they punched sideways or down. You take her hand gently, tell her it's garbage, that she's brilliant, funny, and far more entertaining than any bitter illustrator with a grudge and a printing press. She nods, smiles, barely. You fold the card and toss it into the nearest puddle. You both watch it dissolve. Later that night you sit down to write your own Valentine. Not a sarcastic one, a real one. You choose your best paper, your finest pen, and you write about the way she walks into a room like she belongs there. Because she does. About how her laugh is smarter than most people's best ideas. About how love shouldn't require shrinking yourself into something smaller, just to be acceptable. No rhymes, no peacocks in waistcoats, just truth. You seal it with wax, deliver it by hand. And when she opens it, her smile breaks the gloom of that terrible drawing like sunlight through a cracked window pane. Love, in this era, isn't easy. It's filtered through rules, filtered again through class, and smothered under the weight of etiquette. But sometimes, despite all that, it breaks through, in real words, on real paper, from someone who sees you clearly and chooses you anyway. Vinegar is sharp, but love, when it's honest, is sharper. It starts with a head tilt. Not hers. Yours. You're seated in a small study with questionable wallpaper, and a man in a waistcoat 3 sizes too tight, who is currently tapping your forehead with a pair of calipers. He squints, mutters something about your benevolence ridge, and makes a small note on a chart labelled Cranial Attributes of the Marriageable Gentleman. This is your Saturday now, because someone, possibly your uncle, possibly the neighbour who reads too much, has suggested that science might help you find the perfect match. Not chemistry, as in romantic spark, but literal, measurable, bump on your skull. Let's map your personality with a ruler science. You've entered the curious world of phrenology and Victorian matchmaking. You try not to laugh as the phrenologist gently pokes at the back of your head and says, "Ah, yes, a strong occipital lobe. That's the seat of fidelity." What does that mean? You have no idea. But he seems pleased and mildly smug. You nod politely while clutching your dignity like it's made of crumbling shortbread. Historical fact, phrenology, the pseudoscientific belief that the shape and bumps of a person's skull revealed their mental traits, became wildly popular in the 19th century. Though now thoroughly discredited, it was once considered cutting edge, especially among middle-class Victorians obsessed with self-improvement and social progress. Some believed phrenology could guide everything from career paths to romantic compatibility. Why waste time on courtship when your skull already knows who you should marry? The phrenologist hands you a small mirror. Notice the development here, he says, pointing to a slightly raised area above your ear. That's your amativeness region. Very promising. Suggests strong capacity for affection, tempered by restraint. He says this like he's describing a prize-winning cow. You thank him, pay a ridiculous fee, and walk out with a certificate that reads, well-balanced temperament, good domestic instincts, moderate appetite for adventure. You're apparently ideal husband material, so long as no one looks too closely at your suspiciously shallow cautiousness groove. It's nonsense, obviously, but not everyone sees it that way. Fringe fact, some Victorian newspapers printed matchmaking ads with phrenological details, as in, young woman of pleasing manner, strong organ of conscientiousness and large reflective faculties seeks partner with developed ideality and firm chin. Which is frankly just the 1800s version of listing your Myers-Briggs type and horoscope sign in a dating profile. But phrenology wasn't the only science dragged into romance. The Victorians were obsessed with quantifying love. There were graphology tests, handwriting analysis used to judge personality. There were complexion guides, claiming certain facial features suggested moral superiority. Even eye colour was analysed. Blue eyes were pure, hazel eyes were mysterious. Green eyes? Untrustworthy, obviously. And then there were matchmakers, not just meddling aunts, though they were still undefeated, but paid professionals who claimed to find romantic matches based on temperament charts, family histories, and a healthy dose of creative fiction. Entire agencies operated out of back rooms and newspaper offices, promising clients everything from eternal bliss to someone who wouldn't snore. Here's where the scholarly debate comes in. Were these pseudosciences and matchmaking systems empowering tools for love, or just more ways to enforce class and gender expectations? Some historians argue that phrenology and matchmaking offered a sense of control in a world full of social pressure. Others point out that they were often used to reinforce harmful ideas, especially about race, gender, and class. It wasn't just quirky, it was often dangerous. Back in your own head, you're starting to wonder if your amativeness ridge is actually helping you at all. You hand the phrenology certificate to your partner half as a joke, expecting laughter. But she reads it carefully, then bites her lip. Well, she says, I suppose if your ideality is adequate, I can tolerate your low firmness. You both burst into laughter, because of course none of this matters. Not really. The shape of your skull doesn't explain why you catch your breath every time she walks into a room. It doesn't chart the goosebumps you get when she brushes your hand. It doesn't quantify the hours you've spent thinking of the curve of her handwriting, and yet you keep the certificate, folded neatly in a drawer, a relic of a time when people tried very hard to turn mystery into math. That night, you walk together through the square, past lamplighters and late vendors. You pass a shop window with a display of courtship books and phrenological busts, all labelled and numbered. You pause. She looks at the display, then at you. Do you think, she says softly, that we're scientifically compatible? You look at her face, lit gold by gaslight. Think about how she laughs, how she argues, how she's not afraid to make fun of your reading voice or call out your terrible croquet aim, and you say, absolutely not, which means we're perfect. She smiles, takes your hand, and suddenly the world feels just right. Bumps, charts, and all. Love may not be measurable, but it is most definitely real. You've been labelled. Not officially, of course. No wax-sealed notice arrives at your door with the Queen's signature and a hand-delivered diagnosis, but it happens just the same. A whisper here, a glance there, a change in how people greet you. One week you're the toast of every tea table, and the next, no one quite makes eye contact. You said the wrong thing, wore the wrong expression, got caught standing too close to someone you weren't officially walking out with. And just like that, you're not just unlucky, you're ruined. Yes, ruined. As in, socially scorched earth. As in, your name removed from guest lists with the same urgency as one might erase a wine stain from lace. This is the part of Victorian romance no one sings about. The part where one wrong move, one rumour, one slightly too long walk unchaperoned can end your romantic career forever. And it's worse, of course, if you're a woman. Historical fact. In Victorian society, a woman's reputation was everything. Her value on the marriage market, and make no mistake, that's what it was, rested almost entirely on the perception of her purity, modesty, and social behaviour. To be seen as too forward, too flirtatious, or, heaven forbid, sexually experienced, even just suspected. That could brand you as unmarriageable, and since marriage was, for most, the only path to financial stability, ruin wasn't just emotional, it was economic. For men, the rules were different. A ruined man might be considered racy, unreliable, even bohemian, but rarely completely unsalvageable. A ruined woman? Her future narrowed to two possibilities: become someone's regrettable secret, or disappear entirely. You watch it happen to someone you know, not well, but well enough. She was clever, lovely, a bit too quick with her smiles. Rumour has it she met a gentleman behind the stables during a country house party. No one knows what happened. No one needs to. The suggestion alone is enough. She's not invited to the next dinner, then not to the picnic. Then her name vanishes from conversation, replaced by silence and a vague shake of the head. You see her one afternoon on the edge of the park, alone, not reading, not walking, just sitting, her bonnet low. She sees you, and you nod politely. She doesn't nod back. Fringe fact. Some families tried to hide their ruined daughters by shipping them off to relatives in other towns, or worse, to asylums or reform houses. One such establishment, the Magdalene Laundries, promised to purify wayward women through laundry work and prayer. Spoiler, they did not. It was punishment disguised as redemption, and for many women it was a life sentence. The word ruin is whispered behind fans like it's a terminal illness. She was ruined, poor thing. He ruined her, you know. Such a shame, she had prospects. But no one says what it really means. No one says how it happens or why it's only ever applied to women who break rules that were impossible to follow in the first place. Here's where the scholarly debate flares hot. Was this intense focus on female virtue simply moral overreach, or a calculated way to limit women's autonomy? Historians argue both. On one side, some suggest it was part of a larger Victorian project to maintain order in a society spinning faster with industrialisation, changing class dynamics, and women who were starting to want more. Others point out that it allowed men enormous freedom while keeping women dependent, judged and scared. Either way, the system was deeply uneven, and it didn't always require scandal. Sometimes, a woman was ruined simply for being too outspoken, too educated, too unbothered by what people thought. The kind of woman who laughed a little too loud at a joke or read French novels without hiding the covers. The kind of woman who made people nervous. You think about your partner, how she sometimes challenges your opinions, sometimes teases propriety, sometimes forgets to be modest. You love those things. But you also know what it would cost her if someone decided she was inappropriate. Not you, her. That night you tell her as much. She's quiet for a moment, then says, "I'm not afraid of ruin. I'm afraid of never living." You can't breathe for a second. Then you kiss her hand, and mean it. She's braver than anyone gives her credit for. But bravery doesn't make you bulletproof. She's still operating in a system that's rigged, where a reputation can be undone by a lie, or even the truth told too loudly. Later, you attend a party and overhear someone laughing about that poor girl who got herself into trouble. You say nothing. Then you turn to them and say calmly, "Maybe she was pushed." The laughter stops. conversation shifts. You know you didn't change the world, but maybe you nudged it an inch. The girl in the park never returns to society. You hear she's gone to live with a cousin in Derbyshire. You never find out if it's true. That's how these stories end, not with resolution, but with silence. But you don't forget her. You keep her in your mind as you write your next letter, hold your next conversation, weigh your words, and quietly, you promise yourself this. If the time ever comes, you will not let someone you love be ruined by whispers and rules and silence. Not if you can help it. You're at dinner. Not your dinner, mind you. A family dinner. Not your family either. Hers. You're seated between her great-uncle, who is mostly asleep, and her cousin Henrietta, who is definitely not. Henrietta is smiling at you like she already knows how many buttons are on your undershirt. Across the table, your beloved is trying very hard not to laugh, because she knows exactly what this is. It's a test. You thought courting a person meant getting to know them, sharing letters, dancing, discussing the finer points of treacle pudding. But the truth is, and you should have realised this by now, you're not dating a person. You're dating their entire family tree, every last meddling, matchmaking, side-eyeing branch. You nod politely as her father asks for the third time what your income is after deductions. Her mother casually inquires whether you have any unusual health conditions that might one day trouble an heir. You're chewing roast chicken while trying to explain your stance on railroads, marriage settlements, church attendance, and whether you've ever had the mumps. This is not dinner. This is polite interrogation. Historical fact. In the Victorian era, marriage wasn't just romantic, it was strategic. Families viewed it as a merger, a way to solidify social ties, improve status, and secure financial futures. You weren't just choosing a spouse, you were choosing a position, and the family wanted to ensure you weren't about to drag their daughter into disgrace, debt, or scandal. Hence the interviews disguised as soup courses. You answer as best you can, you compliment the roast, you laugh at the great-aunt's story about the bishop who fell asleep in the choir loft. You dodge Henrietta's increasingly suggestive gaze. Your beloved watches you with quiet amusement, and you can almost hear her thoughts. You're doing fine. Just don't mention the cricket incident. Then the conversation shifts. Someone mentions the Mortimers, specifically the one who eloped with an actress. Everyone makes the same face like they've all just tasted a sour grape. You're expected to make a comment. You say, "Acting's a noble art, Shakespeare after all," and trail off as 4 sets of eyebrows rise in synchronised horror. Wrong move. You've now been gently classified as a bit modern, dangerous, slightly suspicious. Fringe fact, Victorian families often deployed professional matchmakers or relied on experienced relatives who took matchmaking as seriously as some take real estate investments. These were the family strategists, armed with lists, charts, and gossip. They arranged meetings, orchestrated seating charts at dances, and in some cases exchanged letters behind the young couple's backs to negotiate terms. Think romantic chess, but with more lace and fewer legal rights for the pawns. Your meal continues. Pudding is served. You've passed the economic stability portion, just barely squeaked through lineage, and now you're facing the final exam. Values. Her grandfather, who has been silent the entire time, now turns to you with eyes that have seen wars, plagues, and several generations of eligible buffoons. He asks simply, "What does marriage mean to you?" Everyone stops chewing. You feel your pulse in your ears. You could say something safe. Duty, family, partnership. You could quote a bit of scripture, or recite that one passage from the etiquette manual you definitely skimmed once while half asleep. But instead you look across the table at her. She's already looking at you, and you say, "It means choosing someone every day, even when you don't feel like smiling. It means staying kind when it's easier to be clever. It means being a team when the whole world is in the mood to criticise." The silence hangs for a beat. Then her grandfather grunts. Fair enough. That's the highest praise you're going to get. Here's the scholarly debate. Did families meddle in Victorian relationships out of genuine care, or just controlling tradition? Some argue that with fewer social safety nets, families had to vet their children's suitors carefully. A bad marriage could ruin not just one life, but an entire household. Others point out that the system often prioritised status over compatibility, and love was frequently an afterthought, if considered at all. In truth, it was likely both. Concern cloaked in power dynamics, protection laced with control. After dinner there's tea, you help carry trays, you compliment the china. Her mother finally smiles at you in a way that feels less like analysis and more like approval. Henrietta, however, winks. You pretend not to see, you walk your beloved to the door, the hallway is dim, quiet, and for once yours. She leans toward you and whispers, "You said team! They'll be talking about that for a week." You grin. "Was it the wrong word?" "No," she says. "It was the right one. But now they think I'll run off with you at the first chance." You pause. "Will you?" She tilts her head. "Only if your great-aunt approves." You both laugh quietly, conspirators in a world obsessed with appearances. You kiss her gloved hand and step out into the cool night, heart light, face flushed, stomach full of meat and scrutiny. The stars are bright. The moon hangs above like a silent witness. And somewhere behind a lace curtain, someone is definitely watching you leave. Because in Victorian courtship, you're never just courting a person. You're applying for a lifelong position, under the watchful eyes of the entire board of directors. You hear it in whispers first, at tea, at church, in the corner of the dress shop where two matrons lean conspiratorially over a bolt of black satin. "She's still unmarried," one hisses, as though discussing a crime. 32 and still a spinster. The word lands with all the grace of a dropped chamber pot. You're meant to gasp. You don't. But you definitely make a mental note. Because here's the truth no one in a silk waistcoat wants to admit. Not everyone marries, and not everyone wants to. Welcome to the shadowy, scandalous, quietly defiant world of spinsters and bachelors. Those strange, suspicious creatures who dared to sidestep the great Victorian romance machine. You've seen them, of course. The aunt who never remarried after her fiancé died in 1849 and now collects pressed flowers and moral superiority. The gentleman at the club with suspiciously well-groomed sideburns and an allergy to long-term commitment. They're not anomalies, they're everywhere. But society treats them like cracked china. Interesting, but broken. Historical fact. In Victorian England, the term spinster originally referred simply to a woman who spun wool for a living. By the 19th century, it had evolved into a legal and social label slapped onto any unmarried woman over a certain age, usually 30. A bachelor, on the other hand, often kept his dignity a little longer. While an older unmarried man might be teased or pitied, he was rarely punished. A confirmed bachelor might even be seen as dashing. A spinster, almost always tragic. And yet, many so-called spinsters lived full, interesting, fiercely independent lives. Some were educators, writers, or travellers. Some lived with other women in arrangements discreetly referred to as companionships. Some raised nieces and nephews, ran households, or simply chose quiet over compromise. They didn't marry because they didn't want to, or didn't need to. The difference is choice, and that's what unsettled people. You attend a dinner party one evening where you're seated next to Miss Talbot, age 40, never wed, sharp as a stiletto. She asks if you enjoy your work. You say yes. She asks if you plan to marry. You hesitate. She smiles. "Marriage," she says, "is the best thing that ever happened to people who've never spent a full day alone in blissful silence." You laugh. She doesn't. She's not bitter. She's just honest. She tells you she once considered marriage, but the man was boring and not in the useful way. She decided she preferred her own company. Now she has a dog, a library, a subscription to 3 periodicals, and a firm grasp on Latin. She raises an eyebrow at your expression. "You don't have to be married to be complete," she says. "Just competent." Fringe fact. The rise of the new woman in the late Victorian period gave birth to a small but growing group of women who openly rejected traditional roles. They sought education, employment, and independence. And while they were often mocked in newspapers as unsexed, man-hating anomalies with bad hair and aggressive opinions, they also terrified people because they represented the possibility of freedom. Bachelors too lived in a strange social limbo. A man who remained unmarried could be a libertine, a poet, an eccentric inventor, or simply someone who never found the right match. People would speculate, of course. Perhaps he was shy. Perhaps he had a secret family in Scotland. Perhaps he played piano too well. But rarely was he cast out. Here's the scholarly debate. Was the stigma around unmarried women a form of protection or punishment? Some argue that labelling women as spinsters allowed society to manage its expectations, to explain away female independence as a sad accident. Others suggest the label was weaponized, a way to shame women into submission, into believing that without a husband, they were incomplete, inconvenient, or unnatural. But behind the labels, real people lived real lives. Rich ones, messy ones, quiet, joyful, or chaotic. You think of Miss Talbot, returning to her cottage with a new book under one arm and her dog trotting beside her. You think of the older gentleman in town who plays chess with himself in the park and once told you he nearly married at 20, but changed his mind after reading Shelley. You begin to realise something. These people aren't cautionary tales. They're alternatives. Not everyone finds love, not everyone wants to, and not every romance ends in a lace-draped altar with rice and expectations. Some people choose solitude, some choose freedom, some choose friendships that outlast most marriages, and some, many in fact, aren't choosing at all. They're just living. You and your partner talk about this one evening, curled on a bench in a quiet corner of the park. She mentions her aunt who lives with another woman in Bath and sends the best Christmas boxes. You mention your great-uncle who once said, "A man should marry only if he's willing to listen to someone else breathe for the next 50 years. You both laugh, but quietly you agree. If this hadn't worked out, this thing between you, you'd have been fine, not ruined, not broken, just different. And that's the secret, isn't it? The one no one says out loud at the dances or the dinners or in the church pews beside the ever-hovering matchmakers. You don't have to marry. You don't have to love. You don't have to be part of the story everyone else insists is the only one that matters. You can choose your own. And sometimes, that's the bravest love story of all. You board the train with your gloves still damp from the mist, your hat tilted just so, and your nerves very much not in order. The platform is chaotic. Porters shouting, steam hissing, children darting through legs with sticky fingers and terrifying velocity. You scan the compartments as you walk the length of the train, and there, just as hoped, is an open seat across from her. Well, not entirely open. There's a picnic basket, a small novel, and a chaperone/maiden aunt who's already giving you the kind of glare that could curdle milk. But there's a seat. There's her. And in the Victorian world of romance, this is as close to unsupervised flirtation as you're ever going to get. You tip your hat, ask politely, and the aunt moves the basket with a sigh. You settle into the velvet seat, your knees almost touching hers across the small carriage floor. She smiles over the rim of her book. You nod. She looks back down. The aunt coughs. Game on. The train jerks into motion, and so does the conversation. Casual, of course. Nothing scandalous. You talk about the weather, the condition of the tracks, the dreadful scones served at the last garden party. But under it all, something crackles. It always does on trains. There's a shared sense of movement, of momentum, of something about to happen that no one can control. Historical fact. Victorian train travel revolutionised not only industry and trade, but courtship. For the first time, men and women could travel together in relative privacy. Compartmentalised seating arrangements, especially in first and second class, allowed for close proximity that would have been utterly inappropriate anywhere else. And while social rules still applied, the train offered a kind of liminal space, not quite public, not quite private, where flirtation could exist, however briefly, without immediate consequences. She shifts in her seat, and your knee brushes hers, just slightly, just once. The aunt glances up. You both pretend nothing happened. She asks you if you've read Cranford. You say yes, and she asks who your favourite character is. You know the answer she's expecting, but instead, you pick one of the lesser characters, make a gentle joke about the town's obsession with lace. She laughs, actually laughs. The aunt pretends not to notice. Outside the window, the English countryside blurs by in shades of green and grey. Sheep, trees, the occasional startled pheasant. You talk more freely now. You ask what she's reading. She shows you the cover, the woman in white. You raise your eyebrows. Bold choice. She shrugs and says she likes a bit of mystery. Fringe fact. During the mid to late 1800s, it became common for newspapers to run anonymous personal ads from people who'd locked eyes, or exchanged a few thrilling words, on a train. Gentleman in grey coat, 2:15 to Paddington, your smile lingers. Some of these turned into pen pal romances, others into real relationships. Most vanished like steam on the breeze, sweet and fleeting. You offer her a biscuit, she declines. Then 10 minutes later, accepts. You both nibble in silence for a bit, your fingers dusted with crumbs. It's not much. but it feels like something. Here's the scholarly debate. Did train travel really relax the rules of courtship, or did it just create new ways to enforce them? Some argue that trains were liberating, giving young people space to talk, flirt, and even travel together, gasp, without parental interference. Others point out that this freedom was tightly policed. Women rarely travelled alone, compartments had strict rules about gender mixing, and entire etiquette guides were written about how to behave gracefully while travelling. One even warned against engaging in conversation with unknown gentlemen unless introduced by the conductor or a clergyman, because apparently the clergy had jurisdiction over flirtation at 40 miles per hour. You pass through a tunnel. For a moment everything goes dark. Her hand is resting on the seat beside her. Yours is resting a little too close. In the velvet-smothered dimness, your pinkies almost touch. Not quite, but close enough that your breath catches. Then light again. Fields, trees, the aunt adjusting her shawl. You clear your throat and ask if she's travelling for pleasure or obligation. She says she's visiting cousins. You say the same. Both of you are lying. You're here for this. For the possibility of a conversation, a connection, a stolen glance made possible only by iron rails and miles of polite pretense. Eventually the train begins to slow. Her stop is first. She gathers her things, smooths her gloves, gives the aunt a subtle look that says, "Don't ruin this." Then she turns to you and says quietly, "Thank you for the conversation." You stand, tip your hat. "May I write to you?" The aunt opens her mouth, perhaps to protest, perhaps to issue a Victorian growl, but she closes it again. "Yes," she says. "You may." She steps off the train. The steam hisses between you like a sigh. You watch her walk down the platform, posture perfect, skirt hem just skimming the floorboards. She doesn't look back. But she doesn't have to. Because somewhere in the motion of the train, between the ginger biscuits and the damp countryside, and the ever-watchful chaperone, something real happened. It wasn't long, it wasn't scandalous, but it was yours, and in the tightly controlled world of Victorian romance, a shared train ride was sometimes the wildest thing of all. The graveyard is quiet, save for the wind stirring through yew trees, and the occasional rustle of skirts brushing against old stone. You're walking side by side, no chaperone this time, unless you count the statues of long-dead generals and headless angels. It's not exactly the park or the conservatory, but somehow it feels more intimate, more honest. Because in Victorian romance there's something surprisingly seductive about death. You glance at her. She's reading a tombstone, one hand resting gently on the mossy top. The inscription is faded but still legible. "Beloved wife, departed 1843. She tilts her head. "Only 32, she murmurs. "That's barely a lifetime." You nod, unsure whether to comment on the brevity of life or the beauty of the carving. Both seem too forward, or too personal, or not enough. You didn't plan this stroll. It just sort of happened. The vicar's niece was supposed to host a poetry reading, but she caught a cold and cancelled. So now, instead of listening to someone painfully whisper ode to a skylark, you're ambling through rows of gravestones with the person you've spent the last 6 weeks trying not to fall head over heels for. It's peaceful. It's quiet. It's romantic in a way no ballroom ever could be. Historical fact. Victorians were deeply obsessed with mourning, remembrance, and the aesthetics of death. Cemeteries weren't just resting places. They were public parks, ideal for Sunday strolls, picnics, and yes, gentle courtship. London's Highgate Cemetery became a fashionable destination, not just for the dead, but for the living who wanted to walk among marble tributes and wrought iron fences, contemplating love, mortality, and where to stand for the best lighting. You pass a mausoleum shaped like a miniature temple. She remarks that it's overly dramatic. He was probably a banker, she adds, trying to buy heaven the way he bought everything else. You laugh. Too loudly. A nearby robin startles. You lower your voice. "You'd want something simpler?" She shrugs. "Something with ivy, a bench, nothing too self-important." You imagine a small headstone beneath an oak tree, her name delicately carved, a line of poetry etched beneath it. You shake the thought away. She's not dead. She's right here, cheeks pink with wind and hair escaping her bonnet in rebellious curls. And you are not writing elegies. You are possibly falling in love, in a graveyard. Fringe fact. The Victorians had mourning jewellery, rings and brooches made with actual human hair, often from a deceased loved one. Lockets were common too, some containing tiny portraits, others filled with ashes or pressed flowers from funerals. Wearing a loved one close to your heart wasn't a metaphor, it was literal. She points to a stone that reads, "We shall meet again." "Do you believe that?" she asks. You pause. The right answer is something hopeful, something gentle. But all you can say is, "I don't know, but I believe we should meet while we can."
She looks at you, really looks. There's something about the stillness of the place that strips away pretense. No dance steps, no scripts, no chaperones coughing in the background. Just stone, silence, and shared humanity. That's the thing about death in Victorian romance. It wasn't hidden away. It was everywhere. Infant mortality was high. Epidemics swept through cities. Accidents happened. People wrote about death, painted it, built ornate monuments to it. Mourning was not only accepted, it was expected. A sign of depth, of character, and, in a strange way, of love. Here's the scholarly debate. Did this death obsession make the Victorians more emotionally healthy, or did it weigh them down with melodrama? Some argue that the rituals of mourning helped people process grief in a structured, meaningful way. Others believe the constant visual reminders, the black veils, the crepe-covered mirrors, the endless etiquette, kept people stuck in a cycle of performative sadness. But either way, it made love sharper, more fragile, more urgent. You sit on a stone bench beneath a weeping willow. She sits beside you, not too close, but close enough. She folds her hands in her lap. "I wonder what people will say of us when we're gone," she says. "If they'll think we were happy." You want to tell her that if this moment is any measure, then yes, some part of you already is, but that's too much. So instead, you say, "They'll say you had excellent taste in graveyards." She smiles, and you had an odd way with compliments. You sit together in silence for a while, letting the cold sink into your bones. It doesn't matter. The warmth comes from somewhere else, from her presence, from the small comfort of being known, even slightly. You watch a cloud of breath rise between you, ephemeral, vanishing. Eventually she stands. "We should return," she says. They'll start whispering. You nod, standing too. But before you leave, she stops in front of a gravestone with a carved pair of clasped hands. "Look," she says, "together even after." You don't say anything, but you feel it, the weight of it, the hope of it. As you walk back down the gravel path, you feel her hand brush yours for a moment. It could have been the wind, or the slope, or just an accident. But then she doesn't move away. Neither do you. Love, it turns out, doesn't need a ballroom. Sometimes it blooms best in the shadow of everything that might one day end. Quiet, soft, alive. You can feel the note before you see it, tucked under your plate at breakfast, folded into a crisp triangle. It practically hums with anticipation. Your name is written in fine script, the sort that takes practice and the sort of upbringing that includes proper penmanship drills at age 6. You glance around, no one watching. You slip it into your pocket, casually take a sip of tea, and excuse yourself with a muttered something about the post. Upstairs, in the half-light of your room, you open it slowly. The paper smells faintly of violet. The ink is a soft gray, not black, not bold, just deliberate. Her handwriting, of course. You know it by now as well as your own. Curved, elegant, but with just enough flourish to suggest a mind that likes to push at the edges. Inside, one sentence. "Tonight, the ball, if you still mean it." You reread it 3 times, your heart drumming hard in your chest. The ball. The ball. The one your aunt has been talking about for 3 weeks. The one with invitations delivered in tissue-lined envelopes like holy relics. The one where everyone will be watching. And judging. And speculating. The one where people expect declarations, or at the very least, strategic hand-holding. Historical fact. Public balls were more than just entertainment in the Victorian world. They were social theaters where reputations were built, alliances hinted at, and courtships made official. A gentleman could signal serious intentions simply by asking a young lady for a second dance in the same evening. That's how high the stakes were. 2 waltzes in one night? You might as well have proposed. By late afternoon, you've mentally rehearsed everything from a grand romantic gesture to a dramatic mid-dance exit. You settle on moderation, you'll speak to her, ask her to dance, maybe suggest a walk afterward if the weather holds, and the chaperones are distracted by cake. You'll be measured, respectable, charming. You arrive at the ball in a blur of candlelight, perfume, and strategic compliments. The room is already thick with anticipation. The music is soft, the kind that builds slowly, violins preparing to gossip. You scan the crowd, nod at familiar faces, make awkward small talk with a woman who once beat you at croquet and never quite forgave you for existing. And then, she enters. It's not a grand entrance, there's no spotlight, no trumpets. But still, everything pauses. She's wearing a dress the color of overcast sky just before a storm. Her gloves reach past her elbows, and there's something deliberate in her posture. Straight, composed, as if daring the room to blink first. You move toward her. She sees you. For a split second, everything else dims. The chandeliers, the lace, the curated music. It's just the two of you, suspended in the possibility of a question neither of you has yet asked aloud. "May I?" you ask, offering your hand as the quartet begins the first notes of a waltz. She takes it. Fringe fact: while Victorian dances were choreographed and rule-bound, couples still found ways to subvert expectations. The waltz, once considered scandalous for its closeness, became a hotbed for discreet intimacy. Gloved fingers pressed a little too long, eye contact that lasted one beat too many, feet that touched and then didn't. It was choreography laced with coded messages. You glide into motion. At first, it's mechanical. Step, turn, step. Don't crush her feet. But then something shifts. The music wraps around you like a warm fog, and your movements fall into rhythm, not just with the orchestra, but with her. You find yourself anticipating her turns, her weight, her breath. It's like you've been dancing together in another life. And in this moment, you still mean it. Whatever it is. Maybe it's love. Maybe it's just the need to keep turning with her in this golden light forever. You don't say anything. You just look at her, and she nods, barely, and squeezes your hand. Here's the scholarly debate. Were these public events liberating for lovers, or simply another trap of performance? Some historians believe balls gave women and men a rare space to connect outside family surveillance, where music and crowd movement allowed for semi-private moments. Others argue that the intense visibility turned everything into theater, every laugh, every glance, choreographed and judged, leaving little room for actual vulnerability. But maybe it was both, a stage and a sanctuary. You finish the dance. People are clapping politely. No one's fainted or shouted scandal, which feels like a victory. You walk her to the edge of the room where the air is cooler and the lights a little dimmer. "Walk with me?" you ask quietly. "Not yet," she replies, glancing toward her mother. You understand. This isn't a runaway romance. You're not leaping into carriages or defying entire bloodlines, yet. This is the part where you wait, where you let the world catch up to the decision already beating inside your ribs. Still, as she steps away, she turns and whispers, "After supper, garden path, near the fountain." You nod, just once. The room surges back into noise and motion, but for the second time tonight, it barely touches you. Because you're dancing a new kind of waltz now. One with no music, no steps, no guaranteed ending, just promise. And two people who, for the first time, might finally be moving toward the same future. The supper bell has rung. The string quartet has taken a much-needed break. The room is filled with the rustle of silk, the clink of crystal, and the low hum of heavily coated gossip. Some of it about you. You've managed to pretend interest in a plate of cold tongue and asparagus jelly, all while your mind fixates on a single location. The fountain. Garden path. After supper. That's your destination. You excuse yourself as politely as one can after barely touching the custard and not even pretending to enjoy the blancmange. A few raised eyebrows follow you. One gentleman chuckles knowingly into his wine. You ignore them, Tonight, you're not here for appearances. You're here for her. You step out into the night. Historical fact: Victorian gardens weren't just landscapes, they were arenas. Controlled, curated, and coded. Designed for walking, yes, but also for whispering. The garden was one of the few socially acceptable places a courting couple could be alone together, sort of. Provided it was early evening, not too secluded, and a maid or cousin was somewhere within polite shouting distance. The air is crisp, just this side of cold, and smells faintly of lilac and damp stone. The moon is out, half hidden behind a patchwork of clouds, just bright enough to make the hedges shimmer silver. Gravel crunches softly beneath your shoes as you follow the winding path toward the fountain. Each step feels louder than it should, as if the whole night is holding its breath. She's there before you, standing by the basin, her gloved fingers trailing along the edge of the carved stone. The water is still, reflecting the sky like a mirror that's not entirely trustworthy. She turns when she hears you, and smiles. "Did anyone see you?" she asks, teasing. "Just 3 matrons and your cousin," you reply. "So only half of London." She laughs quietly. The sound of it echoes against the rose-covered trellis. You stand together for a moment, not speaking. There's no need. The silence is full, comfortable, charged. She looks at the fountain. "I used to think wishes made at fountains were more likely to come true," she says. Something about the water, the sound, the movement. And now? I think wishes are just feelings with better lighting. Fringe fact: in the Victorian age, many people believed in symbolic gestures during courtship, dropping a handkerchief, snapping a fan shut, offering a flower. But water, especially in gardens, held special meaning. Reflective pools and fountains were associated with inner truth, emotional depth, and romantic fate. In literature, a walk by water was never just a walk. You step closer. "I didn't know if you'd come," she says. "I didn't know if I should." She tilts her head. "Then why are you here?" There's no easy answer. You could say it's because of the way she makes you forget your name when she laughs, or how she can quote half of Byron and all of the sarcastic parts of Persuasion, or the fact that every room feels smaller when she enters it, and larger at the same time. But you don't say any of that. Instead, you say, "Because I've stopped imagining a future without you in it." And that's it. Here's the scholarly debate. Did Victorian couples ever really confess love like this? Or is that just modern romantic projection? Some argue that overt declarations were rare and discouraged. Emotion was supposed to be contained, restrained, civilized. Others point to letters, diaries, and poems full of the kind of passion that would embarrass even today's hopeless romantics. Maybe the truth lies somewhere in between. Feelings felt deeply, expressed carefully, and often whispered only when the world wasn't looking. She exhales slowly. "I've waited a long time to hear that," she says, "and I'm not afraid of it. But," you brace for it, "I need to be sure we want the same things, not feel the same, not dream the same, want the same." She's smart enough to know that love alone isn't a life plan. You nod. "I want something real," you say. "Something we build, not something handed to us with rules already written." She smiles again. "Even if the neighbors disapprove?" "Especially then." She reaches up and touches the lapel of your coat. Not a caress, more like she's checking for stability, for truth. "Then yes," she says. "I mean it too." The moment lingers. And then, just when you think she'll lean in, she steps back. Just half a step. The distance is not rejection, it's deliberation. She says, "Write to me, something real, not just a poem or a quote. I want your words, not borrowed ones." You nod. "Tomorrow." "Not tonight?" "Tonight I'll remember," you say. "Tomorrow I'll write it down." Fringe fact: private letters between Victorian couples were often kept for decades, tied in ribbon, hidden in boxes. They were treasured more than any photograph. In a world of polite silence, letters were where real voices lived. And when couples couldn't speak aloud, paper became their confessional. She turns to go. No kiss, no dramatic exit. Just a look over her shoulder, one that says everything. And then she's gone, her figure swallowed up by hedges and shadows and the strange, beautiful quiet of an English night. You stay by the fountain a little longer, watching the water, hearing her voice echo softly in your mind. A wish reflected back, one that for once doesn't feel foolish. You sit at your writing desk with the lamp turned low, the house asleep around you. The paper is smooth beneath your hand, and the ink bottle wobbles slightly with every shift of your elbow. Outside, rain is falling, softly, steadily, the kind of rain that makes the world feel wrapped in wool. There's no music, no distractions, just this letter, this moment. You begin. It's not a poem, no rhyming couplets, no borrowed lines from Tennyson or some dusty volume you half remember from school. It's just your voice, honest and plain, the way she asked for, the way she always speaks to you. You write slowly, pausing now and then, not to find the right word, but to make sure the feeling still fits. You tell her that yes, you still mean it, that the idea of partnership isn't something you stumbled into like a dance step, but something you chose, that you admire her mind, her kindness, her sly smirks, and her inconvenient questions. You say that when you think of the future now, it's not a manor or a title or some legacy to maintain. It's waking up and wondering what she'll think of the newspaper headline, or the weather, or your terrible handwriting. You don't know if it's eloquent, but it's real. Historical fact. Love letters in the Victorian era were an essential part of courtship. Often exchanged in secret, they allowed couples to express intimacy that society otherwise restricted. A well-written letter could strengthen a bond, clarify intentions, or, in more than a few cases, end an engagement. Some were written under candlelight, some were dictated to trusted servants, some were burned, unread, and some were kept for lifetimes. You fold your letter carefully, sealing it with wax, not because you have to, but because it feels right, personal. She'll break it with her thumb, smear the wax across her nail, and you like the idea of her doing that, like she's opening something sacred. You fall asleep imagining her reading it. The next morning you deliver it yourself. No servant, no footman, just you and your coat and a knot of nerves that tightens with every step. Her housekeeper takes it without blinking, as though young men with flushed cheeks and wax-sealed declarations appear at the doorstep all the time. Maybe they do. Maybe you're just one more suitor with a nice pen and too many feelings. But an hour later, you receive a note. Shorter than yours. Only a few lines, but powerful in its precision. Yes, let's talk to our families, and then let's plan something less boring than a June wedding. You grin like an idiot. Fringe fact. Despite all the rigidity of the Victorian marriage machine, many couples did fall in love. Genuinely, fiercely, rebelliously. And when they did, they sometimes broke rules. Eloped, postponed weddings, lived in separate wings, had whispered agreements about reading real books, not just improving ones. The system bent now and then for people brave or stubborn enough to push against it. And that's what you do, together. You meet with her father. He doesn't smile, but he doesn't throw anything, so you count it as progress. You sit through long talks about dowries, expectations, and family names. You nod in all the right places, even when the discussion of furniture inventory makes you want to hurl yourself into a hedgerow. Through it all, she is steady, clear. She deflects when needed, sharpens when necessary. Once, she squeezes your hand under the table, and you squeeze back so hard the teacup rattles. There's no dramatic proposal, no sudden kneeling on gravel or speeches under moonlight. Just agreement, alignment. A slow unfolding of possibility that feels stronger than any single moment. Here's the scholarly debate. Was Victorian marriage really built on love, or was it an elaborate business contract with a floral border? Some say love was a luxury, not a requirement, that marriage was about property, bloodlines, and stability. Others argue that within those constraints, people still carved out space for affection and intimacy. They found ways to love, not despite the rules, but through them. You spend the next weeks planning and dreaming. You meet in libraries, in gardens, once, scandalously, at a cafe where someone's aunt might have spotted you if she hadn't been busy scolding a waiter. You talk about the future, about books and travel and how to survive holidays with extended family. You argue, twice, once about paint colors, once about the morality of fox hunting. Both times you come out stronger. Your friends nod approvingly. Your enemies raise eyebrows. One distant cousin writes a letter warning you that independent women make unsatisfactory wives. You burn it without reading the rest. On a quiet Sunday, she visits your home, walks the rooms, asks gentle questions. She stops in the study, touches the desk, and says, "This is where you'll write to me when we're annoyed with each other." You laugh, but it sticks with you. The truth of it. The quiet acceptance that love is not a constant high, but a choice made over and over. Finally, you stand together in the drawing room, looking out the window at the wet garden. She says, "This is going to be difficult." You say, "I've never wanted anything more." You take her hand. She doesn't pull away. You're not married yet. The announcement hasn't gone out. The church hasn't been chosen. But something has shifted. Something final. You're no longer dancing around the idea. You're in it now, together,